I wasn't planning on staying at the cabin for long. It was supposed to be just a quiet weekend to get away from the noise. I'd been working nonstop for months. City life was burning me out. Long hours, barely sleeping, eating junk food on the go, and constantly checking emails. I was feeling drained. So when a friend offered me his family's cabin for a few days, I said yes without even asking too many questions. He gave me directions, handed over the keys, and told me it hadn't been used in a while, but everything should still work. The cabin was deep in the woods, about 2 hours from the nearest town and maybe 15 miles from any paved road. It was the kind of place where you lose phone signal long before you even see the front porch. The last 15 miles were slow, bumpy, and full of trees pressing in from both sides of the dirt path. I had to drive with my windows rolled down just to hear if anything was scraping under the car. When I arrived, the cabin looked old but solid. It was made of dark wood, probably logs underneath, and it stood alone in a small clearing surrounded by trees that stretched so tall I had to crane my neck to see the tops. There was a small porch with 2 wooden chairs and a rusted-out grill pushed off to one side. The windows were dusty. The air smelled like pine, damp earth, and that dry wood scent that comes from a building that's been sitting quiet for too long. Inside, the cabin had one main room with a kitchen area, a small table, an old couch, and a stone fireplace. There was a small bathroom off to the side and a single bedroom tucked behind a crooked door that stuck whenever I opened or closed it. The floorboards creaked, and I could hear every step I made echo back at me. Everything felt still, like the place was holding its breath. The first few hours were peaceful. I unpacked some food, grabbed a few blankets from the closet, and started a small fire in the fireplace even though it wasn't that cold. The quiet was nice. I sat on the porch for a while and watched the wind move through the trees. Around evening, I cooked some simple food on the gas stove, just some rice and canned beans, and ate while looking out the window. The trees looked darker now. Shadows stretched longer, and everything outside started to feel just a little heavier. I told myself it was just the change in light, nothing more. That night, I turned in early. I read a book under the small lamp beside the bed. I kept the windows shut because of bugs. At some point, I must have dozed off. I woke up in the middle of the night, not sure why. It was completely silent, except for the occasional creak of wood. That kind of silence you only hear when you're far from everything. The next morning, I got up around 7, made some instant coffee, and walked outside barefoot. The ground was cold and slightly wet from morning dew. I checked around the cabin just out of habit. I always do that when I'm in a place I don't know well. Everything seemed untouched. No signs of animals or anything unusual. It was later that day when I noticed something strange. I'd walked maybe 20 minutes into the woods behind the cabin. I was just exploring, not really paying attention to where I was going. I wasn't worried about getting lost because I was following a small slope down, thinking I could just trace it back up when I returned. I saw a few deer tracks, a small stream, and a lot of fallen branches. The trees were thicker here. It was quiet except for some birds. That's when I saw a beer can. It was an old crushed one, a brand I didn't drink. It looked weathered but not ancient, maybe a few weeks old. I bent down and picked it up, turning it over in my hand. I figured someone must have hiked through here recently, but when I looked around, I didn't see any other signs of people. No footprints, no wrappers, just that single can. I didn't think too much of it at first, but something about it sat wrong with me. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed some scuffed dirt near the back wall, close to the kitchen window. It looked like someone had stepped there, maybe with boots. I hadn't walked that close to the wall myself. I brushed it off as maybe an old mark I hadn't seen before. That night, I locked the front door, checked the windows, and made sure the fireplace was completely out. I crawled into bed and left the lamp on. The wind picked up during the night, and I kept waking up to faint noises. Thumps, soft rustling, maybe a branch falling. I told myself it was nothing. The next day, I checked around the cabin again. I took a stick and poked around the brush near the back wall. I didn't see anything new, but when I stepped out to the porch, I noticed something that stopped me cold. One of the chairs had moved. I was sure of it. The left chair had been near the edge of the porch, and now it was turned slightly and facing the front yard, angled different than before. It wasn't wind. These chairs were heavy old wood. They didn't slide unless someone physically moved them. I walked around the cabin again. Still nothing. I felt my heart starting to beat faster. I went back inside, locked the door again, and sat with my back to the wall. That evening, I skipped dinner. I just didn't feel hungry. I sat in the main room and watched out the window as the light drained from the sky. I didn't turn on any lights. I just sat still, listening. I don't know what I was waiting for. It was well past midnight when I heard something move outside. It was faint, but definitely footsteps. Slow, crunching through leaves. They stopped somewhere near the porch. I held my breath. Then I heard the wood of the porch creak. Once, then again. Someone was walking across it. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe loud. I just sat there, frozen. The footsteps stopped. Then, nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake in the chair, barely blinking. When the sky started to get light, I got up slowly and went to the door. I opened it just a crack. There was a footprint on the porch. It wasn't mine. It was bigger, and it was wet like someone had stepped through mud before walking there. I checked the clearing. Nothing. No one. I knew then I wasn't alone out there. I started making a plan to leave. I packed up some food, water, and my clothes. But something told me not to leave in the middle of the day. I couldn't explain why, but I had this thought. What if someone was watching from the trees? What if they waited until I left and then followed? I decided to wait until the next morning to drive out. I'd sleep during the day, then leave just before sunrise. I kept my keys in my pocket and stayed alert. That night was worse than the one before. Around 2 a.m., I heard tapping on the window, slow and light, like someone gently drumming their fingers on the glass. Then it moved to another window, then the next one. I couldn't see anything. I didn't want to look. I just sat still, heart pounding, trying not to make a sound. The tapping stopped. Then I heard the back door rattle. Just once. Not hard enough to open it. Just a quick jolt, like someone testing it. I stayed awake until the sun came up. When I finally went outside, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were small marks carved into the wood near the windows, for little straight lines grouped together. Then another set, then another, like someone had been keeping count. I didn't care what it meant. I was done. I threw my bag in the car, locked the cabin, and drove out of there without looking back. The drive felt longer. I kept checking the rearview mirror. The woods didn't feel peaceful anymore. They felt tight, like they were closing in. I didn't stop once. Not even when a deer crossed the road in front of me and I had to brake hard. I just kept going. When I finally made it back to the main road, I stopped for gas. I walked into the store and felt like I could breathe again. The sound of a TV playing, the hum of refrigerators, people talking, felt like waking up. I told my friend about it weeks later. He seemed surprised. He said no one had used the cabin in over a year, but his uncle used to go out there all the time. Said he liked the quiet. When I asked what happened to his uncle, he paused. Said they found his car near a river 10 miles from the cabin. The keys were still in it. No one ever found him. I never went back to that cabin. I never even drove near those woods again. And sometimes, late at night, I still think about those marks on the window. I think about how many groups of 4 there were. I remember counting them. There were 28, and I had only been there 3 days. I needed to be alone. Things had built up too much back home. The stress, the noise, the job I couldn't stand anymore. The people. Every single day felt heavier than the last. I wasn't trying to escape my life completely, just trying to get some air, some distance. I thought a few days away in the woods would be enough to clear my head. I picked a cabin that was far from everything. No cell service, no internet, no other cabins nearby, not even a gas station for miles. I found the listing online. A small wooden cabin tucked into the base of a pine-covered mountain, surrounded on all sides by dense forest. It looked old but clean. There were photos of a wood stove, a small kitchen, a single bed with a worn red blanket. The porch faced the trees, and behind it was nothing but thick brush and rocky hills. I booked it for 6 days. The drive took nearly 7 hours. Most of it was highway, but the last hour was slow and rough. The gravel road was narrow and lined with trees so close they scratched the sides of my truck. My GPS stopped working about 20 minutes before I arrived. I kept going anyway. I followed the handwritten directions I had saved from the host, checking landmarks as I passed them. Fallen log, a small red-painted sign half covered in moss, a sharp turn just past a dried-up creek. It all felt like the start of a slow, quiet kind of peace. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, it was almost evening. The sun had started dipping down between the trees. The air was cool, not cold, just crisp in that way you only feel deep in the woods. I stepped out of the truck and stood still for a long moment. No traffic sounds, no airplanes, no voices, just the steady hush of wind moving through the trees and a few birds calling out from somewhere far above. I unpacked slowly, one big backpack with clothes and supplies, a duffel with dry food, and a few plastic jugs of water. There was a stream nearby, but I didn't want to rely on it. The cabin didn't have running water. It had a small outhouse behind it, about 20 yards into the woods. The place had power from a solar setup, but just enough for lights and charging a phone if needed. I wasn't planning to use my phone. Anyway, inside the cabin was exactly like the photos. Old wooden floor, some knots and warping here and there, a small table, a narrow bed, one window in the front and one in the back. The front window looked out toward the porch and the woods beyond. The back window showed nothing but more trees, thick and green and endless. It was quiet inside, too. The kind of quiet where you hear your own blood moving in your ears. That first night, I didn't do much. I heated up some canned soup on the gas stove, sat outside on the porch for a while, and watched the last of the light fade through the trees. I didn't have any deep thoughts or breakthroughs. I just sat there, staring at the shadows growing between the trunks, feeling how thick the forest was. That silence again, thick like syrup. I noticed how dark it got, really dark, the kind of blackness you don't see in cities. The moonlight barely made it through the branches. I went inside, locked the door out of habit, and slept like a rock. The next morning I woke up early. Light came through the front window around 6. I made some instant coffee and oatmeal, then stepped outside. The air smelled clean, cold dirt and sap. I stood for a while listening. There were birds again. I heard what I thought might be a squirrel or something bigger rustling somewhere in the underbrush, but I couldn't see it. It didn't bother me. I was deep in the woods. Of course there'd be animals. That day passed quietly. I read, I hiked a short trail nearby, and I took some pictures of the moss-covered rocks and the giant trees that seemed to curve inward above me like a dome. I came back before dark, ate some jerky and crackers. No problems. It was the second night when things started to feel strange. It was subtle at first, just a sound. I was in bed, staring at the ceiling, half asleep. Then I heard something from the back of the cabin, a soft snapping sound, like a branch breaking underfoot. I waited, listened, nothing else. I told myself it was a deer or maybe a raccoon. I'd seen tracks earlier, after all. I went back to sleep eventually. The third day was cloudier. The sun never really broke through. I stayed close to the cabin. I felt off. Not sick, just slightly on edge. That sense when something small is out of place, but you can't tell what. I thought maybe I was just not used to being alone this long. Or maybe the silence was finally starting to get to me. I brushed it off. Spent the day chopping some dead branches around the cabin for the stove, clearing the path to the outhouse. That night, I heard the sound again. This time it was louder. Same spot, behind the cabin. First a snap, then what sounded like a foot dragging over dry leaves. I got up, went to the back window and looked out. It was hard to see. The moon was behind the clouds, and the trees were thick. I squinted into the dark and saw nothing. No movement, no eye shine, nothing. I didn't sleep well. The fourth day, I noticed something strange. About 100 feet from the outhouse, there was a small clearing I hadn't seen before. I thought maybe I had just missed it, but that didn't make sense. It wasn't that far off the path. The grass there looked pressed down, flattened like something had been laying there. I walked into the clearing. In the center, I found what looked like scraps of fabric. Torn, faded, and damp. Piece of denim. A strip of red cloth. I bent down and picked one up. It was wet and smelled earthy. Not rotten, just old. I didn't know what to make of it. I stood there for a long time, just looking at the flattened grass and the fabric. Then I heard a branch snap again. Same sound, just beyond the clearing. I turned, but again, nothing there. I left the clearing and walked quickly back to the cabin. I told myself I was overthinking it. Maybe a hunter left it. Maybe some hikers passed through last season. Still, I locked the cabin door as soon as I got back, even though I normally didn't lock it during the day. That night, the sounds came back again. This time, it was more than one. I lay still in the bed, eyes wide open, heart pounding. First a crunch, then another. 2 separate steps, then silence. Then something touched the back window. It was soft, not a bang, just a gentle tap. I didn't move. I lay frozen in the bed, breathing as quietly as I could. After a long minute, I got up and walked to the window. My hands were shaking. I looked out. Nothing. But I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Smudges. On the outside of the glass. Fingerprints. Not full handprints, just the tips. As if someone had pressed only their fingers against the glass. I stood there for over an hour, staring out into the woods. That was the night I stopped sleeping. I sat up with my back against the front wall, watching both the front door and the back window. I kept the lights off. I thought if someone was out there, they wouldn't know I was awake. I didn't hear anything else that night, but the sense didn't leave. That pressure, that tension, like something was crouched just past where I could see, waiting. The 5th day, I didn't leave the cabin. I kept the door locked and the windows closed. I watched the trees through the cracks in the curtains. Around noon, I saw something move between the trunks. A quick flash of motion. Human-sized. Couldn't be sure. It was too fast, too far away. But it was upright, not an animal. I told myself again it was a hiker, a hunter, someone lost. But that didn't explain the tapping, or the fingerprints, or the torn cloth in the clearing. I sat at the table with a knife in my hand all afternoon. That night, the tapping came again. Both windows this time, one after the other. Then footsteps, around the cabin. I could hear them, slow, deliberate, circling. I held my breath and didn't move. Then I heard the porch creak. Something stepped onto the porch. Then it stopped. I sat in the dark, heart hammering, knife in my grip, afraid to even blink. Then a loud, slow knock at the door. Not frantic, just one knock, then another, then silence. I didn't move, didn't answer, just sat there in the dark. I stayed like that until morning. When light finally came, I stood up and looked outside. No one was there, no footprints, no marks, but something had changed. The door frame had a scratch on it, deep and fresh, like someone dragged a nail or a knife along it. I decided to leave that day. I packed everything fast, shoved it into the truck, and started driving down the gravel road. I didn't care if I left things behind. I just wanted to be gone. The forest felt heavier. The trees looked closer. The road seemed longer than I remembered. I kept checking the rearview mirror. Every time I passed a bend, I expected to see someone standing in the road behind me. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling didn't leave. When I got back to the highway, I finally got service again. I called a friend. It was a bad decision from the start, and I knew it the moment I stepped out of the truck and felt the cold mountain air hit my face. There was no phone signal, no other cars in sight, and the narrow gravel road behind me disappeared into thick pine trees so dense they looked like a wall. I had told myself this trip would be good for me. Get away from town, clear my head, spend a few quiet days at my cousin's hunting cabin. But truthfully, I was here for another reason. One I didn't tell anyone. A month before I came here, a man escaped from a prison transport near this area. He was a violent offender, the kind you read about in the last paragraph of a news article after everyone's already scrolled past. The kind that slips through cracks and disappears, especially in places like this. Endless forests, unmarked trails, thousands of hiding spots. They never found him. I'd been following every post, every breadcrumb dropped by amateur searchers on forums, every half-baked tip on true crime message boards. And one night, someone posted a grainy photo taken by a game camera mounted a few miles outside of Flat Ridge, a small town I'd only heard about once before. It showed a thin man with no shirt, carrying a blanket and walking barefoot through snow. That's all it took. I booked the time off work the next morning. The cabin belonged to my cousin Matt, but I had the keys. He used it for hunting during the season, but this time of year it was always empty. No one stayed out here in January unless they had a reason. The cabin was small, just one room with a loft above, a stone fireplace, and a covered porch. No electricity, just a battery-powered lantern and some firewood stacked by the door. There was a small creek about 50 yards downhill where you could fill a container if you needed water. And that was it. You were on your own. I unpacked fast. I didn't bring much, just some instant food, a sleeping bag, binoculars, printed topographic maps of the area, and a few other essentials. Most of my time was going to be spent outside, looking for signs, tracks, scattered belongings, old fires, anything that showed someone had been out here for a while. That first night, I made a fire in the small stove and tried to sleep early. But my head was racing. I wasn't scared, just wired. I kept listening for sounds outside. Wind pushed through the trees like moving water, and every once in a while I heard something snap. Maybe a frozen branch, maybe a deer, but nothing else. The dark outside the cabin was absolute. My flashlight beam barely went 10 feet before fading into black. The second day I hiked southeast, along the edge of a dried-up creek bed. The snow was thin in places, but I wore snowshoes to avoid leaving obvious tracks of my own. After about 3 hours of searching, I saw something, a pair of boot prints, old but real, leading uphill into thicker woods. They weren't from a hunter. They were uneven, dragging slightly like someone injured had made them, and they led toward a place marked on my map as a disused ranger station. My pulse started picking up. It was still early enough in the day, and I had food and a radio just in case. I decided to follow them. After climbing for over an hour, I found the place. It wasn't much. A half-collapsed wood structure with no roof and a broken chimney sticking out of the top like a jagged tooth. Someone had stayed there recently. There was a blackened fire pit surrounded by rocks, and some broken branches stacked near it. What made me uneasy wasn't the fire pit. It was the pile of bones in the corner. Small, like squirrel or rabbit bones, picked clean, burned. This wasn't someone camping for fun. Whoever was staying here was desperate. I left quickly, heading back the same way I came, trying to stay alert but calm. I didn't want to panic and make a mistake, like getting lost or falling on ice. By the time I got back to the cabin, it was almost dark. I double-checked the door, pulled the blinds tight, and sat for a long time by the fire with the lantern off, just listening. I heard nothing unusual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I kept waking up, not because of noise, there wasn't any, but because my mind wouldn't shut off. I kept picturing those boot prints, the fire pit, the bones. I started to wonder if maybe I had crossed into someone else's territory, someone who didn't want to be found. The third day, I stayed close to the cabin. I walked in slow circles, looking for anything I'd missed before. At one point, I went around the back of the cabin, and something caught my eye. A small torn piece of fabric snagged on a branch just a few yards from the wall. It was dark brown, weathered, maybe from a jacket. It hadn't been there when I first arrived. My skin went cold. I scanned the woods in every direction, holding my breath. Nothing moved. I picked up the fabric, stared at it, then tossed it into the fire. Felt like a warning, or maybe it was just trash. Either way, I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the stove creak as the fire died down. And at some point near dawn, I heard footsteps, not from the woods, from the porch. I froze. My heart was pounding so hard I felt it in my neck. The footsteps were slow and soft, like someone stepping carefully. I didn't move. I just listened. I heard the wood of the porch creak once, then again, then silence. I waited for a knock, a voice, anything, but nothing came. After about 10 minutes, I quietly got up, grabbed my knife, and crept to the door. I didn't open it. I just looked through a small gap between the boards. There was no one there. The snow on the porch had been disturbed. The prints were fresh. They led toward the woods and vanished beyond the tree line. I stood there for almost an hour, watching the edge of the forest, waiting to see if anything would move. Nothing did. That morning, I packed my gear. I had enough. Whatever I thought I was doing out here, I had pushed too far. This wasn't some fun amateur manhunt anymore. I felt like I had woken something up, or maybe just caught its attention. I put out the fire, took down the food line from the tree, and loaded everything into my backpack. But before I could leave, I heard a sound that made my stomach drop. A shutter on the side of the cabin creaked open. It had been nailed shut when I arrived. I turned fast and saw the wooden shutter swinging lightly in the wind. It moved like it had just been pushed, but no one was there. I walked to it slowly, scanning the woods the whole time. The nails that had held it in place were on the ground, not rusty, freshly pulled. They were bent like someone had forced them out with bare hands or a rock. I didn't stop to think anymore. I just started walking fast down the trail toward the truck, almost jogging. I kept checking behind me every few seconds, but nothing followed. The woods were silent, too silent. When I got to the truck, I reached for the keys in my jacket. They weren't there. I froze. I checked every pocket. I dumped my backpack. Nothing. I opened the passenger door, searched under the seats. Still nothing. I clearly remembered putting them in the inside chest pocket of my jacket that morning. They were gone. Then I saw something on the hood of the truck. A small pine cone, perfectly placed in the center. It hadn't been there when I left. It was too perfect, too deliberate. My hands were shaking. I backed away slowly and sat on the tailgate. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to walk back to the cabin. I didn't want to stay near the truck either. I felt stuck, like a rat in a trap. About an hour later, I saw movement in the woods. Far off, maybe 200 yards away. A shape, tall, thin, moving slow. It didn't come closer, just stood still behind the trees, watching. I couldn't see a face or clothes, just the outline. I pretended not to see it and slowly reached for the flare gun in my pack. I only had one flare. I aimed it straight up and fired. The red flame shot high and burst in the sky. After that, I didn't look back at the shape. I focused on gathering my things, keeping calm. I sat quietly and waited. 2 hours passed. The shape never moved, but it also never left. Just before sunset, I heard the sound of an engine. A ranger's truck came down the trail. They had seen the flare. I waved them down and told them I'd lost my keys. I didn't mention anything else. Not the bones, not the shutter, not the pine cone. I never went back to the cabin. I told Matt someone had broken into it and that I didn't feel safe there. I didn't explain further. A few weeks later, I read that they found a campsite deep in the woods near Flat Ridge. Inside a hollowed-out tree, they found clothing, cans, and a blanket. No one was there, but it had been used recently. The local paper ran a small piece about it, saying they were following leads, but no arrest was ever made. Sometimes at night, when I close my eyes, I see that shape again, standing perfectly still behind the trees, watching, not running, not hiding, just watching. And sometimes I wonder how it got my keys. It was early September when I drove up to the cabin, tucked about 10 miles from the nearest small town in the woods of northern Montana. I had rented it online through a private listing that said it was perfect for hunting, writing, and escaping the noise of the modern world. The photos showed a worn-looking place, with pine trees pressing up against the porch, a fire pit out front, and a small lake just a short walk downhill. I didn't care much about looks. I wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere without cell towers, without traffic, and without people. And this cabin seemed to fit. I arrived just after noon, the dirt road taking me further and further from the highway. There was a short gravel path that turned off and wound around a grove of thin, tall trees before ending in a circle in front of the cabin. It was small, maybe 25 feet long, 15 feet wide, with faded brown siding and a tin roof patched with spots of rust. A stack of split firewood sat under the edge of the overhanging roof beside the door. A metal chimney stuck out the side, and the only sign of power was a thick cable running from a solar panel rig on the back porch to a gray box next to the steps. I parked, stepped out, and immediately noticed the silence. No wind, no animals, not even the sound of insects. Just that strange kind of pressure you feel in your ears when it's too quiet. It didn't bother me. I had spent enough time alone in places like this to know it would pass. Inside was even simpler than I expected. One large room with a bed in one corner, a wood stove in another, and a table with a small camping-style gas burner and sink that connected to a tank of water out back. The listing had said there was no indoor bathroom. I already knew I'd be using the outhouse 20 feet behind the shed. I spent the rest of that first afternoon unloading my gear. I had packed everything I needed: clothes, food, tools, maps, and notebooks. No electronics. I didn't even bring my laptop. Just stacks of lined paper and a bag full of pens. I wanted to write the old-fashioned way. I walked the property a bit before the sun went down. The lake was about the size of a football field and had a thick line of reeds along the shoreline. It looked clean, and I dipped my hand in and tasted it out of habit. Cool, clear, no algae smell. The woods behind the lake were thick, mostly pine with some birch and alder. No clear trails, which I liked. I'd brought a machete in case I wanted to make one. I ate a can of beans and some bread for dinner and watched the sunset through the trees. The sky went from blue to orange to that deep fading red before the stars came out. It got cold fast. I lit the wood stove and sat on the floor with a blanket and a notebook on my lap, writing whatever came to mind until the heat filled the cabin and my eyelids got heavy. I went to bed early that first night, probably around 9. I remember waking up once, sometime deep into the night. I couldn't tell if it was a noise or just the cold that stirred me. The fire had gone out and the room was pitch black. I heard something outside, a light crunch of gravel, just once. I lay still, listening for more, but heard nothing. No footsteps, no wind, just silence again. In the morning, everything seemed normal. There were no footprints on the gravel that I could see. No signs of animals. The air felt crisp. I made tea on the burner and sat outside on the small wooden chair someone had left on the porch. I watched the sun come up through the trees, feeling like I had finally arrived at the quiet I'd been looking for. I spent that second day writing, mostly scattered thoughts and notes. I chopped some wood for the fire. I walked to the lake again and followed the edge of the trees around it, trying to see if there were any signs of game trails. I saw a set of old deer tracks in the mud, but no fresh ones. It was peaceful. That night I cooked rice and boiled some lentils. The air got colder, and I noticed the wind had picked up. The trees creaked more than they had before. I lit the stove early and stayed up reading an old paperback I'd brought until I fell asleep again. Sometime in the night, I woke up again. This time it was a definite sound, something like a metallic thump. Not loud, but sharp. I sat up in bed, heart suddenly beating faster. The fire was out again, and I could barely see anything. I stayed there for at least 5 minutes, not moving, just listening. Another sound, softer, came from outside, like gravel being stepped on. One footstep, maybe two. I sat up slowly and reached for the flashlight by my bed. I flicked it on and pointed it toward the window. Nothing. I got up, wrapped a coat around myself, and opened the door. The cold hit me hard. I stood there, shining the light in a slow circle around the yard. That's when I noticed it. There was a small tree about 20 feet away, to the left of the path that led to the outhouse. A thin pine just thick enough to hide a person behind it. And for a moment, I swear I saw something move behind it. A shift, a small lean like someone was adjusting their weight. But then it was gone. I stood there a long time watching. No other movement, no sound. Eventually, I closed the door and stayed awake until dawn, the flashlight still in my hand. When morning came, I went straight to that tree. No footprints. The ground was hard and dry. I walked in circles, checked behind the shed, looked under the cabin. Nothing. But I knew what I saw. I told myself it was paranoia, my mind playing tricks from being alone for too long. I told myself that again that night, when I locked the door and shoved the table against it. I told myself that again the next morning, when I found the back window unlatched. I was sure I had closed it before. That day I didn't write much. I sharpened my axe. I walked a wide loop through the woods, marking trees with a pocket knife so I wouldn't lose track of my path. I didn't see anyone, but I had the constant feeling that I was being watched. Every time I looked over my shoulder, the woods were still, but the hairs on the back of my neck didn't go down. I got back to the cabin just before sunset and saw something that made me stop cold. A strip of bark had been peeled off one of the trees near the porch. It wasn't from an animal. I could see clean scrape marks, straight with a blade. A few feet above the ground, maybe waist height. It was fresh. That night I didn't sleep. I didn't even try. I kept the fire going and sat up with the axe across my lap, staring at the door. Around 2 a.m., I heard the gravel again. Footsteps. No rush. Just slow, steady steps circling the cabin. Once, twice, then a pause, then nothing. When the sun came up, I opened the door and stepped out with the axe in hand. I looked for footprints again. I finally saw one, half of one, pressed into a patch of soft dirt near the side of the house. It was a man's boot print, bigger than mine. I knew then I wasn't imagining anything. I packed a bag. My plan was to leave to hike the 5 miles back to where my car had broken down 2 days earlier. Something I didn't think much about at the time. It had just refused to start, and I figured it was the battery. I planned to hike out, get help, and have a tow truck bring it in. But I didn't make it far. About a mile into the hike, I found something hanging from a branch. A piece of blue plastic cord tied in a loop. It wasn't there before. I was sure of it. I kept walking. I saw another one 20 minutes later, red this time, and then a third, all loops, hanging at chest height, swaying slightly in the breeze. I turned back. I didn't want to keep going if someone was leading me somewhere. Back at the cabin, I sat with the axe for hours. No writing, no fire, just silence. That night, I heard the footsteps again, but this time they didn't stay outside. I heard the back door creak, the one I had nailed shut that morning. I stood up slowly, backing into the corner with the axe raised. Then silence again. I stood there for what felt like forever. I waited for movement, for breathing, for anything, but nothing came. When the sun rose, the back door was closed again, but the nails were gone. That was the final straw. I packed everything I could carry, took the axe and a knife, and left. I walked 5 miles through the trees, avoiding the trail I had come in on. I didn't want to risk walking into another trap. I moved fast, didn't stop. I didn't even drink water. When I reached the highway, I flagged down the first car I saw, an older man in a red truck. He let me use his phone to call for help. It turned out the cabin didn't belong to anyone anymore. The owner had died 2 years earlier. The listing I used was fake. A few parts of it were copied from an older website, but no one had been renting that place in years. The sheriff's department went out to investigate. They found the peeled bark, the plastic loops, even the old footprint, but no sign of anyone else. I haven't been back to the woods since, but sometimes, when I walk alone through a city or even a parking lot, I find myself checking behind trees, just to make sure there's no one standing there watching, waiting, because the worst part isn't what I saw out there. It's what I didn't see. Whoever it was, they were patient, quiet, careful. They didn't try to hurt me. I was 34 when I took a break from everything and went off the grid for a while. I had been working back-to-back jobs for years and never really took time off. No vacation, no breaks, nothing. Just work, eat, and sleep. My health was getting worse and my mind was not in a good place. I would wake up tired and go to sleep more tired. So after thinking about it for a long time, I decided to rent a small cabin deep in the forest near the edge of northern Montana, just a few miles from the Canadian border. The cabin was owned by an old man who rented it out to people like me, city folks wanting to get away for a while. It didn't have running water or electricity, but it had a wood stove, a small bed, and a table. The forest around it was dense, cold, and very quiet. There was a dirt road that went about 8 miles from the main highway to the cabin. After that, the nearest building was probably 15 miles in any direction. It was perfect. I packed up my truck with food, canned stuff mostly, a few tools, a shotgun, and 2 boxes of shells. I brought a few books and a small solar charger to keep my phone alive just in case of an emergency, but I didn't plan on using it much. There was no signal up there anyway. When I arrived at the cabin, it was around 3 p.m. The place looked exactly like the pictures the old man had sent me. Small log structure, single door, 1 tiny window on the front, another one in the back. The roof looked solid, no holes or missing shingles. There was a small firewood stack out back and a dry well nearby that I was told not to use. I had brought enough water jugs to last me 2 weeks anyway. The first 2 days were peaceful. I would wake up with the sun, make coffee on the fire stove, read for hours, and go for walks in the woods. I wasn't a hunter or anything, but I liked to walk slow and watch animals from a distance. I saw deer, rabbits, and once, a fox that darted across my path and disappeared into the trees. The nights were quiet, completely silent. No cars, no people, no power lines humming. Just wind and the sound of the forest breathing. Sometimes I'd hear twigs snap in the woods at night, probably deer or raccoons. I didn't worry. It was normal. On the 3rd night, something small changed. It was around 2 a.m. I had just woken up to use the bucket I kept near the back of the cabin as a toilet. As I was standing near the back wall, I heard what I thought was a vehicle far off. At first, I figured it was just my imagination, but then I kept hearing it. A low engine rumble, slow and steady, coming from the direction of the dirt road that led to the cabin. I waited and listened. The sound got louder, then stopped suddenly, just cut off. I didn't think much of it. Maybe someone lost or someone hunting. I went back to bed, though I kept my boots and jacket close by that night, just in case. The next morning, I went outside to get more wood for the stove, and that's when I saw tire marks on the dirt just outside the tree line. Not mine. These were newer, and they came from the direction of the road. They stopped about 100 feet from the cabin, behind some trees, and then turned back the way they came. I felt my stomach tighten. Why would someone drive all the way out here and stop behind the trees? I looked around for anything else, but there was nothing. No trash, no footprints, nothing left behind. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was someone looking for a hunting spot. Still, it made me nervous. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about those tire marks. I even stepped outside once around 11 p.m. to check for headlights or engine sounds. Nothing. Just darkness and cold air pressing in from all sides. The next day, I walked the path where I had seen the tire marks. I followed them about a mile toward the road. At one point, I found a spot where someone had stopped and gotten out. There were footprints in the soft mud next to the trees. One set, big boots, maybe size 12 or 13. The person had stood there for a while. I could tell because the tracks were deep and the ground around them was disturbed, like someone shifting their weight back and forth while standing. That made me even more uneasy. That evening, around sunset, I stayed inside the cabin. I didn't go for my usual walk. I kept the stove going and had the shotgun leaned up against the door. I didn't really believe anything was going to happen, but I just didn't feel right. Something about the air felt heavier. At exactly 2:43 a.m., I woke up again. Not because I needed to use the bucket, but because I heard something. A sound I couldn't place at first. A kind of soft clink, like metal against metal. I sat up slowly, heart beating fast, and strained my ears. Came again. Clink. Then again. Like someone brushing against something metallic outside. I got out of bed and moved to the front window. It was dark outside, and the moon wasn't full enough to light much up, but I could just barely make out the shape of something large parked between the trees. A vehicle, not moving. I couldn't see the color, but the outline looked like an old truck. I stepped back from the window slowly, picked up the shotgun, and stood there listening. The sound didn't come again. Whoever was out there wasn't moving anymore. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in a chair near the window with the gun on my lap, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. No movement. No more sounds. When the sun came up, I looked outside again. The truck was gone. No tracks, no smell of exhaust, just empty woods. I thought maybe I had imagined it. Lack of sleep, isolation, fear playing tricks on my eyes. But when I went out there, I found fresh tire tracks again. Same size as before. They had pulled in behind the trees and then left around sunrise. That day, I seriously thought about packing up and going home. But something in me didn't want to leave. I had planned to be here for 2 weeks. It had only been 5 days. I didn't want to give up that easily, so I stayed. For the next 3 nights, nothing happened. I started to relax a little again, but I never stopped looking over my shoulder. I kept the shotgun close. I barely went for walks anymore. I just stayed near the cabin and kept alert. On the 9th night, everything changed. I was sleeping when I heard the sound of gravel crunching. I shot out of bed, fully awake in seconds. This time I knew it wasn't a dream or an animal. It was footsteps, slow and steady, getting closer to the cabin. I didn't go to the window. I just grabbed the gun, made sure it was loaded, and waited. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard something that made my whole body freeze. The sound of a hand sliding across the front door, like someone testing the surface, maybe checking the latch. Then came the knock. It was soft, just one. Then nothing. Total silence. I didn't move. I held my breath for so long I felt like I was drowning. Minutes passed. Then I heard the footsteps again, but now they were moving away. I waited a good half hour before going to the window. The truck was back. This time I could see it more clearly. It was an old green pickup. Looked like a 1980s Ford, rusted in places with no license plate. I stayed up the rest of the night again, and at sunrise the truck was gone. I had enough. I started packing. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just threw everything into the truck, filled up the water jug, loaded the shotgun on the passenger seat, and got ready to leave. As I was backing up, I saw something in the trees near the path. I stopped. It was a man, standing behind a thick pine, about 30 yards off the path. He was wearing a green coat and had long black hair. He was just standing there, watching me. He didn't move. I didn't wait. I slammed the gas pedal and took off down the dirt road, driving as fast as I could without flipping the truck. It took me 15 minutes to reach the highway, and when I got there, I didn't stop. I drove another 2 hours before pulling into a gas station. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the nozzle. Later, when I told the local police, they said they'd check it out. But I could tell they didn't really believe me. I showed them photos of the tracks, but there wasn't much they could do. It was public forest land. No laws against people being in the woods. For weeks after that, I kept dreaming about the knock on the door. Just one knock, soft and slow. I could still hear it in my head, clear as day. I tried to go back to my normal life, but something in me had changed. A few months later, I did some research online, and I found a forum where people posted stories about weird things in the woods. One man had posted about a green truck that followed him while he was camping in Idaho. Same year, same look. No plates. Another man described a knock on his camper door at 2 a.m. in Oregon. When he opened the door, nobody was there, but his dog was missing. I kept digging, and the more I read, the more I realized this wasn't just me. I still don't know who that man was or what he wanted. I never went back to that cabin. Never even contacted the old man who rented it to me. I left it all behind, but I never forgot it. To this day, I still check the windows at night. And sometimes, when everything's quiet and the wind isn't blowing, I still think I hear it. I didn't want to go to the cabin that year. My brother had offered it to me for a break after a bad few months at work, and I took it because I didn't want to explain why I didn't want it. It wasn't the cabin itself that bothered me. It was the silence, the deep, quiet kind that fills up your ears until you start thinking too much. The cabin sat alone in the woods, tucked into the side of a hill, maybe 30 minutes from the nearest small town. You had to drive down a narrow dirt road for about 10 minutes after you turned off the main one, and if it had rained, your tires would throw mud up against the sides of the car the whole way. My brother had kept it in decent shape over the years. We used to go there with our parents when we were kids, but it had been a long time since then. I got there late in the afternoon. It was cloudy, which made everything look dull and gray. I unlocked the door and pushed it open, the smell of the cabin hitting me right away. It smelled like old wood, dust, and the faint scent of mildew that clung to the floorboards and the corners of the windows. The air inside felt thick. I dropped my backpack on the couch and started opening the windows to get some air in. The wind outside made the tall pine trees sway and creak a little, and the sound came through the windows as I walked around. There was no phone service. That didn't surprise me. My brother said I might get a single bar if I stood on a rock behind the cabin and held the phone in the air like a fool. The place didn't have internet either, obviously. Just a generator for power if I needed it, but I didn't turn it on right away. I wanted to save fuel in case it got cold. It was late fall, the end of October, and even though the days were mild, the nights got pretty cold up there. The cabin had 2 small bedrooms, a kitchen, a tiny bathroom, and one main room with a couch and a wood stove. The floor creaked no matter where you stepped, and the windows rattled a bit when the wind blew. I built a small fire in the wood stove that evening, made myself a sandwich, and sat on the couch doing nothing for a while. I had brought a book, but I didn't open it. I just stared at the flames and let my thoughts drift. Later that night, I went to bed early. It was pitch black outside, and the wind had died down, leaving behind this heavy silence. I laid there listening to it. It's strange how loud quiet can be when you're not used to it. Every sound becomes sharper. The ticking of the metal in the wood stove as it cooled down, the groan of the wood in the walls as the temperature dropped, the soft brush of a tree limb outside against the wall. I must have drifted off at some point, but I woke up suddenly. It was still dark, probably around 3 a.m. or so. The room felt colder than it should have. I didn't hear anything at first, but I had this strange sense that something had changed, like I had been pulled out of sleep by something that didn't make a sound. I laid there and listened. Nothing. No wind, no trees creaking, nothing. Then I heard the crunch of gravel outside. It was faint, but I was sure of it. 1, 2, 3 slow steps, then silence. I sat up in bed and held my breath. I listened so hard my ears started ringing. I waited for more footsteps, but they didn't come. I got up slowly and crept over to the window. I didn't want to turn on any lights in case someone was really out there. I pulled the curtain back just a little and looked outside. There was nothing. The gravel driveway ran along the side of the cabin, and it disappeared into the darkness where the trees started. I couldn't see that far. The moon was behind the clouds, and without it, everything just looked like different shades of black. I stood there for maybe a full minute, then slowly let the curtain fall back into place. I didn't sleep much after that. I laid in bed with my ears straining for every little sound. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or something heavier. Could have just been the wood outside settling in the cold, shifting a little. Still, it didn't feel right. Felt like a person. The next morning, I went outside and checked the driveway. There were no footprints, but the ground was dry and packed hard, so I wouldn't have expected to see any. I walked around the cabin slowly, feeling stupid. Everything looked normal, nothing out of place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I thought about packing up and leaving that day, but I didn't want to admit I was scared. I told myself again that it was nothing. I spent most of the day walking the trails behind the cabin, trying to clear my head. There were old logging paths that ran off in a few directions, some leading down to a dried-up creek bed, others just dead-ending in brush. I had walked those paths as a kid, but now everything looked different. Overgrown, narrower. The trees felt closer than they used to. By the time I got back, it was almost dark again. I made another fire, heated up a can of soup, and ate slowly, listening to the fire pop and crackle. I didn't like the feeling that I was waiting for the night again, but I was dreading it. As soon as the sun went down and the shadows filled the corners of the room, I started feeling that same tension creeping back in. That night, I left a light on in the main room and the fire going in the stove. I tried to read a few pages from my book, but I kept reading the same line over and over. Around midnight, I heard a sound again. This time, it wasn't footsteps. It was softer, like fabric dragging across the outside wall. Just one sound, long and slow. I froze. I set the book down and got up quietly. I moved toward the window again and peeked out. Nothing. I stood there for a long time. The sound didn't come back. Eventually, I backed away from the window and sat on the couch, waiting. I didn't go to bed that night. Around 4 in the morning, I heard something again. This time, it was the crunch of gravel again. This time, it was clear. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps, slow and spaced out. They stopped just outside the front door. I didn't move. I sat there on the couch with my hands gripping the sides of the cushion. I stared at the door. The fire was still burning, casting a faint orange light across the floor. The doorknob didn't turn. There was no knock, just silence after those steps. I don't know how long I sat there like that. Eventually, the sky started to get lighter. I heard no more sounds. When the sun came up, I opened the door slowly and looked out. Nothing. No footprints. No broken branches. Just the same gravel path and the woods beyond it. But something had changed. I felt it. I didn't go for a walk that day. I stayed close. I kept looking out the window every few minutes. I didn't make a fire that night. I sat in the dark with the flashlight in my lap, listening. I was too scared to sleep. Every time I blinked, I imagined hearing those same steps again. That third night, I heard them again. Only this time, they came around the back. I heard the leaves crunch first, then the thump of a boot against the wooden steps that led up to the back door. 1 step, 2 steps, silence. I turned toward the sound, holding the flashlight. I didn't turn it on. I just stared at the back door. I couldn't see it from where I was sitting, just the edge of it. I thought I saw a shadow move across the window in the door, just a slight shift, like someone leaned in and looked. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I sat there and waited. Nothing happened. No knock. No footsteps leaving. Just silence. I sat there until the sun came up. In the morning, I walked outside and checked again. Still nothing. But I knew what I'd heard. I decided I was leaving. I packed my bag and loaded the car. I started driving out around noon, and I kept checking the rearview mirror every few seconds. I didn't stop until I hit pavement again. I drove all the way back to my apartment and didn't say a word to anyone for a few days. 3 days later, my brother called. He said a park ranger had called him. Apparently, someone had broken into a different cabin not far from ours, about a mile down the trail. It had been empty for months, but they found signs someone had been living there recently. Food wrappers, empty bottles, and a pile of torn clothes in the corner. A knife stuck in the wall. No one there when they checked. But the door had been locked from the inside. They found marks on the windows of the cabin. Smudges, like someone had been pressing their face and hands against the glass. I didn't say anything on the phone. I just sat there listening. After we hung up, I went and locked all the windows in my apartment. Then I moved my bed so I could see the front door from it. I never went back to the cabin again. I had been planning the hunting trip for over 6 months. It was supposed to be simple, relaxing, and quiet. I needed time away from people, away from work, away from noise. I wanted to sit in silence, hear my own thoughts again, and just be in the woods, breathing fresh air. I was 37, single, lived alone in a small apartment in the city, and I hadn't taken a proper vacation in years. When my uncle told me about an old cabin he used to rent out decades ago that still stood way up in the northern woods, I asked if it was still usable. He laughed and said probably not, but he hadn't been up there in years and I was free to try. That was good enough for me. I packed up my gear, made sure my rifle was clean, stocked enough dry food and water for 10 days, filled my truck, and left early on a Tuesday morning. The drive took about 9 hours. The first 6 were just highways and small towns. But after that, the road got worse. By the 8th hour, I was on a gravel road surrounded by thick forest, and by the time I got to where I had to park, I had been crawling along at 10 miles an hour, dodging potholes and branches. I left my truck near an old logging trail and hiked the rest of the way. The cabin was about 4 miles in. No power, no cell service, no neighbors, no roads, just trees, hills, silence, and one tiny wooden cabin that hadn't been used in over 20 years. When I finally got there, it looked even rougher than I expected. The roof sagged slightly, the wood was gray from rain and age, and the porch looked like it would fall through if I jumped on it. But it was still standing. The door worked. The inside was dusty, dark, and full of spider webs, but it was dry. That was the most important thing. There was an old bed frame, a table, a small counter, and a rusted-out iron stove in the corner. No plumbing, no power, and no insulation worth mentioning. But it was home for now. I unpacked my gear, swept out as much of the dust as I could, checked for animal nests or holes, and set up my cot in the corner. I put my water jugs in the shade near the porch, set my dry food inside the cabinet, and loaded my rifle. I felt good, tired, sore from the hike, but calm. The quiet out there was unlike anything I ever felt in the city. The first few days went by slowly. I woke up early every morning, made coffee over a small gas stove I brought, and hiked out to different parts of the woods to try and find signs of deer or elk. I wasn't really there for the meat. It was more about the quiet, the waiting, the stillness of the woods. I spent hours sitting still near a clearing or up in a tree stand I built from a few planks. I didn't see much. A couple of squirrels, one fox, some tracks here and there, but nothing big. That was fine. I liked the silence. At night, I'd sit on the porch with a small lantern and write in my notebook or clean my rifle. I slept with the rifle near me, not out of fear, just habit. When you're alone that deep in the woods, it's better to keep it close. By the 5th day, things started to feel different. It was small things at first. I woke up to find one of my water jugs moved. I thought maybe I'd forgotten where I put it. Then I noticed a scratch on the side of the cabin that wasn't there before. Just a small cut in the wood, like from a knife or something sharp. I told myself maybe it had been there all along. Maybe I just hadn't noticed it. Later that day, when I came back from my hike, I thought I smelled cigarette smoke, just faint, just for a second. But I didn't smoke, and I hadn't brought anything like that with me. Still, I let it go. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks. I've been alone for 5 days. No phone, no people, just trees and wind and long stretches of silence. That night, I couldn't sleep well. I kept thinking I heard something outside. A stick snapping, leaves moving, a quiet thump against the porch. I sat up a few times and looked through the small window, but it was too dark to see anything. My flashlight only reached the first few trees. I stayed inside, rifle on my lap, trying to tell myself it was nothing. The next morning, I walked around the cabin before breakfast. I found a set of boot prints about 15 feet away, near the back corner. They weren't mine. I was sure of that. I wore heavy hunting boots with a thick sole. These were smaller, lighter, like hiking boots. I followed them for a few feet, but they just vanished into the brush. No trail, no sign of where they came from. My stomach felt tight for the rest of the morning. I didn't go out that day. I stayed close to the cabin. I kept the rifle loaded and my ears open. I walked a few short loops around the clearing, trying to see if anyone else was nearby. Nothing. No voices, no smoke, no movement, just the woods. It was quiet, but it didn't feel peaceful anymore. I started to feel like I was being watched. Every time I walked out past the first row of trees, I felt eyes on me. I kept turning around quickly, trying to catch someone or something. But there was never anything there. Just trees, just wind. But the feeling wouldn't go away. That night, I didn't light my lantern. I didn't cook anything either. I just ate some jerky from my pack and sat in the dark, staring at the window. I kept the rifle across my legs. Every few minutes, I'd get up and walk to the door, listening. It was almost midnight when I heard the first real sound. A footstep, just one, on the dry leaves outside the window. Then nothing. I didn't move. I held my breath. I waited, After maybe 10 minutes, I heard another one. Just a quiet crunch of leaves. Then silence again. My heart was racing. I wanted to open the door and yell out, but I remembered what I had told myself earlier. Don't attract attention. I waited until morning. I didn't sleep at all. At first light, I opened the door slowly and looked around. No one. I walked the perimeter again. This time, I found a broken branch at shoulder height on one of the nearby trees, like someone had grabbed it or pushed through it. A few more boot prints heading off to the west, then gone again. No trail. No sign of where they came from or where they went. I decided I needed to leave. I packed up most of my gear that afternoon. Not everything, just what I needed for the hike back. I figured I'd sleep one more night and leave at first light. It was too late in the day to hike the 4 miles back to my truck and still make it down the logging road before dark. I hated that I had to stay another night, but I didn't feel like I had a choice. I set everything near the door so I could leave fast. I didn't cook. I didn't light anything. I stayed in the dark again. This time I didn't sit. I stood near the window with the rifle pointed at the trees. At some point during the night, I heard a soft scrape against the far wall. Then a knock. Just one. Like a finger tapping the wood. Then nothing. I held still. I waited. My eyes were dry from not blinking. I waited for what felt like an hour. There were no more sounds. I didn't sleep. When the first bit of light came in through the window, I was already dressed and ready. I grabbed my pack, slung the rifle over my shoulder, and opened the door. The first thing I saw was the shoe print, right there in front of the porch. Clear, fresh, facing the cabin. My stomach dropped. I didn't waste time. I hiked fast, faster than I should have with a heavy pack. I didn't stop for water. I didn't stop to rest. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I thought I saw movement in the trees. A shadow ducking back. A flash of something dark behind a trunk. I kept moving. When I finally reached my truck, the door was slightly open. I never leave it open, ever. My heart started pounding again. I raised the rifle and approached slowly. The cab was empty. Nothing was missing, but someone had been inside. The glove box was open. My maps were gone. So was the extra set of keys I kept in the center console. I drove like hell, bouncing over the road, bottoming out in ruts, not caring. I kept checking the mirror. I didn't see anyone, but I still felt like I was being followed. When I got to the nearest town, I stopped at a gas station and locked the doors. I filled the tank, checked the backseat twice, and drove all the way home without stopping again. I didn't tell anyone for a few days, not even my uncle. I didn't know how to explain it. Nothing technically happened. I wasn't attacked. I wasn't hurt, but someone was out there, watching me, walking around my cabin, standing outside at night, getting into my truck, taking my maps and my keys. I changed the locks on my apartment. I started sleeping with my rifle near the bed again. I haven't gone back into the woods since. Not alone. About a month later, I got a small envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was one of the maps I had kept in the truck. The one that showed the cabin, marked with a small red dot. On the back, written in pencil, were the words, "Nice place, real quiet." I moved 2 months later. I needed a break from everything. Work was getting worse every week, and my chest felt tight all the time. It wasn't just the job. It was the noise, the deadlines, the city traffic, the people, the calls, the bills. I couldn't remember the last time I had a day where I didn't feel like something was about to go wrong. So I booked a small cabin way out in the woods of northern Idaho. I didn't tell anyone. I turned my phone off before I left. The place was buried deep in the forest, at the end of a long gravel road. The road was so narrow and uneven that I was sure more than once that my car was going to bottom out. My GPS lost signal about halfway up. I kept driving until I saw the sign, Becker's Rest. It was nailed to a tree pointing toward a steep path. The cabin was tucked into the trees, surrounded by thick brush, dead branches, and pine needles all over the ground. No other houses in sight. Nothing but trees, mountains, and silence. The cabin was old but solid. There was no electricity, just a wood stove, a propane tank hooked to a small burner in the kitchen, and some old lanterns hanging on the walls. There was a water pump outside, about 50 yards from the front porch. Inside, it smelled like dry wood and dust, but it was clean. The furniture was simple: one table, one chair, a small bed, and some shelves with books and tools. There was an axe by the door, next to a metal bucket for kindling. A stack of firewood sat just outside under a tarp. I liked it right away. The first couple days were peaceful. I spent most of the time reading, walking, and sleeping. The days were quiet, and the nights were cold. I made fires every evening and sat close to the stove. I didn't miss my phone. I didn't miss the city. All I heard was wind through the trees, and sometimes birds or the sound of branches falling in the forest. It was the first time in years I didn't feel completely on edge. On the third day, I found a narrow trail behind the cabin that went down into a ravine. It was steep and winding, but I followed it out of curiosity. At the bottom, there was a small creek and some thick brush. I noticed broken branches and what looked like footprints in the mud. They were old but large. I assumed they were from a deer or maybe an elk. I didn't think too much of it. I walked a bit farther, but it started getting dark, so I turned back. That night, something felt off. I heard something outside the cabin around midnight. It wasn't the wind. It was heavier, slow, careful steps. I sat up in bed, holding still, listening. My heart started beating harder. I reached over and grabbed the axe by the door. I didn't turn on the lantern. I just waited. The steps stopped after a minute, and then everything was quiet again. I waited another hour before I finally fell back asleep. In the morning, I went outside and looked around. There were footprints in the dirt near the corner of the cabin. Not animal prints, shoes, big ones. They went around the side of the cabin and disappeared into the woods. My chest tightened again, the same way it used to at work. This wasn't normal. Someone had come up to the cabin at night, just walking around. No one was supposed to be out here. I hadn't seen a single person since I left the main road. I kept the axe with me that day. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, checking the windows and doors. Everything was still locked. I tried to tell myself it was just someone passing through, maybe a hunter or hiker, but that didn't feel right. There were no hunting signs, no trails, and no reason for someone to walk around my cabin in the middle of the night. I tried to ignore it, but that night I didn't sleep much. I left the lantern off again and stayed in bed, holding the axe. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps outside, slow and heavy. This time they came right up to the front door and stopped. I held my breath. I could hear my own heartbeat. The steps stayed for maybe 20 seconds, then moved away. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I checked again. More footprints. Same shoes. They had walked up to the front door, then around the back of the cabin. I followed them a little ways into the trees before I lost them. That was when I realized something else. There was no car. If someone had driven up the gravel road, I would have heard it. Whoever was walking around the cabin was living nearby. Maybe in the woods, maybe in the ravine. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I didn't want to overreact. I had come here to get away from fear and panic. I told myself it was probably a harmless drifter or hunter, but I kept the axe next to me all day, and I didn't go on any walks. That night, I set up a tripwire using a length of twine and some empty cans I found in the shed. I stretched it across the path leading to the front of the cabin. Around 1 a.m., I heard the cans rattle. Something had tripped the wire. I sat up and grabbed the axe. I didn't turn on the light. I looked out the front window, but it was too dark to see. I heard footsteps retreating into the woods. That was it. I didn't sleep again. The next morning, I found the wire on the ground and the cans scattered. There were more footprints, even closer to the window now. I checked the entire cabin. Everything was locked, but I had this sick feeling in my stomach. I wasn't alone out here. I hiked back down into the ravine that afternoon. I followed the same trail as before, this time going farther. About a half-mile downstream, I saw something through the trees, old tarps, branches stacked like a lean-to. I walked up slowly. It was a shelter. Someone had built it against a rock wall, hidden by brush and trees. Inside, there were bones. Animal bones mostly, but some of them looked big. There was also an old backpack, a torn jacket, some tin cans, and a rusted knife. I didn't touch anything. I backed out slowly and made my way back to the cabin. I locked all the doors and windows, shut the curtains, and lit one lantern. I didn't eat dinner. I just sat with the axe in my lap, listening. Around midnight, the sounds started again. Footsteps. Not just one pair, two or three. I sat frozen. Someone tested the door handle. Then nothing. I stayed awake until morning, gripping the axe the entire time. When the sun came up, I threw everything in my bag and packed the car. I didn't even clean up. I just wanted to get out. As I was loading the last of my stuff, I saw something in the woods. Just a flash of movement, a person stepping behind a tree. I slammed the trunk and got in the car. The road out felt longer than it had coming in. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting someone to come running out of the trees. I drove straight back to town, stopped at a diner, and used the phone to call the local sheriff. I told them everything. They didn't seem surprised. The deputy I talked to said people sometimes live off-grid in those woods, and some don't like visitors. They said they'd send someone to check it out, but I could tell they didn't think it was a big deal. I never went back to that cabin. A week later, I got a message from the rental company asking why I had left early. I didn't reply. A month after that, I saw a news story online. A hiker had gone missing in the same area. Search crews found a camp in the ravine, full of bones and trash and tools. They didn't find the hiker. They didn't find whoever built the camp either. The story went quiet after that. No arrests, no names. Sometimes I still think about that night when I heard more than one set of footsteps. I don't know how many were out there. I don't know if they were watching me the whole time, or if they had only just found me. But I know this, if I hadn't left when I did, I don't think I would have made it out. I don't go into the woods anymore. I don't look for cabins, or trails, or peace and quiet. The silence I wanted so badly ended up being the loudest warning I've ever heard. I had been putting off my novel for over a year. It had started as an exciting project, something I truly believed in, but the more time passed, the more I kept finding reasons not to work on it. The noise of the city, the stress of my job, the distractions of my phone, all of it kept me from focusing. I needed quiet. I needed isolation. So I booked a cabin deep in the northern woods, miles from the nearest town, no internet, no cell service. Just a cabin, a stove, running water, and my laptop. I planned to stay for 2 weeks. The drive up was long, over 6 hours. The last part of the road was just gravel and dirt, winding through thick forest. My tires kicked up dust that floated in the rearview mirror for minutes. By the time I arrived, it was late afternoon. The cabin was exactly what I expected. Small but neat. It had one main room with a wood-burning stove, a little kitchenette, a desk, and a bed pushed up against the far wall. There was a bathroom with a working toilet and shower, though the water pressure was low. I had brought enough food to last, and I had backup batteries and solar chargers for my laptop. I was ready to work. The first 2 days went well. I got up early, made coffee on the little gas stove, and sat down to write as the sun rose. The forest was silent except for birds, wind, and the occasional squirrel. The quiet helped. Words came easier. For once, I wasn't checking my phone or opening new browser tabs. I didn't have a choice, no signal. It was exactly what I needed. But on the third day, I started noticing things. It began small, just little things. I went outside in the morning to walk around and stretch my legs. The dirt path in front of the cabin was covered in dry leaves, pine needles, and old footprints, mine. But as I walked, I saw a single shoe print that didn't match mine. It was off to the left, near a cluster of trees about 20 yards from the porch. It looked fresh, like it had been made that morning. It was deeper than the others and didn't have the same tread as my boots. I stood there staring at it for a minute, then shook it off. Could have been from before I got there. Maybe the guy who owned the place. Maybe even an animal that just made a mark that looked like a print. I didn't want to let it get in my head. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I'd been going to bed early, usually by 10, but I lay awake listening to the wind in the trees. It was louder than the night before. The walls creaked more, like they were adjusting to the cold. I thought I heard something outside at one point, branches snapping, a crunch like footsteps, but when I got up to check through the window, I didn't see anything, just the dark woods. I told myself the noise was probably an animal. Deer, maybe. There were plenty around. The next day, I wrote less. My head wasn't in it. I kept thinking about that footprint, kept thinking about the sound from the night before. I looked over my shoulder more while typing. I locked the door, which I hadn't been doing during the day. I found myself standing up every 15 minutes just to walk to the window and look out. Later that afternoon, I took a break and walked down the trail that led behind the cabin. I needed to clear my head. The trail curved through thick trees for about 100 yards, then opened into a small clearing with a rocky outcrop. It had a view of the valley below. It was peaceful. I stood there for a long time, listening to the wind. But as I turned to go back, I noticed something strange in the dirt. A cigarette butt, fresh, still smelled faintly like tobacco. I don't smoke. My chest felt tight. There was no trash around, no beer cans or food wrappers. Nothing to suggest the area was popular or used by hikers or campers. This was private land. The nearest neighbor, according to the owner, was over 5 miles away. There shouldn't have been anyone there, not unless someone had come by recently. I walked back to the cabin fast. I didn't run, but I wanted to. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept the lights off and sat on the edge of the bed listening. The wind came and went in waves. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate crunches through the dry brush. I stayed still. My heart was pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. I didn't want to go to the window. I was scared I'd see something, or someone. Eventually, the sound stopped. I don't know how long I stayed sitting there in the dark, but it was a long time. In the morning, I found footprints circling the cabin. Same tread as the one I saw earlier in the week. This time there were more of them and they were closer to the house. One set went right up to the back window. I checked the locks. I checked all the windows. Nothing was broken. Nothing taken. I didn't see any cameras around. No signs of pranks. I kept thinking maybe I was being paranoid, that maybe I was blowing it out of proportion. But I couldn't ignore what I saw. Someone had walked around the cabin at night. Someone was watching. I wanted to leave, but I also didn't want to panic and ruin the trip. I kept telling myself maybe it was just someone passing through. Maybe a hunter. Maybe they didn't realize the cabin was occupied. But I knew that wasn't true. I kept the porch light on every night. My car was parked out front. Whoever it was, they knew I was there. That day, I didn't write a single word. I packed up most of my food and kept it in a bag by the door. I kept a flashlight and a knife next to the bed. I knew the knife wouldn't do much, but it gave me something. I didn't want to drive back late at night, but I told myself if something else happened, I'd leave at first light. That night, I left all the lights off. I sat by the window in the dark, watching the woods. I didn't see anything for hours, but around midnight, I saw a faint light in the trees, like a flashlight moving slowly between trunks. It wasn't steady. It would blink on, then off, then on again in a different spot. Someone was out there. I stayed low, moved to the corner of the room where they couldn't see me. I didn't move again for what felt like forever. The light eventually vanished, but I didn't sleep at all. When morning came, I went outside and checked. More footprints, a lot more. Whoever it was had gotten closer. There were prints leading right up to the front porch. One was directly in front of the door, another near the window. I walked around the cabin slowly and then stopped cold. Someone had scratched something into the wood on the back wall. 3 vertical lines. Not words, not a symbol I recognized. Just 3 long scratches, like someone had taken a knife or rock and carved it slowly into the wall. Not fast, not messy. Clean, straight, even lines. Deep enough to go through the outer layer of the wood. That was it for me. I packed everything in less than 10 minutes. I didn't care if I left stuff behind. I just wanted out. I threw my bag into the car, locked the cabin behind me out of instinct, and drove fast. The gravel road kicked up rocks that banged against the undercarriage. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. I didn't call the police. I didn't know what I would even say. No one broke in. Nothing was stolen. There was no evidence of a crime, just footprints, cigarette butts, and scratches. I didn't want to be dismissed. I just wanted to be gone. It's been weeks since I left that cabin. I haven't written a word since. I still think about it every day. I still don't know who was out there or what they wanted. I never went back for the things I left behind. I don't even want to see that place again. But what gets me the most is how quiet they were. How careful. Whoever it was didn't want to be seen. They didn't try to scare me in an obvious way. They never broke in. They never made noise on the porch or pounded on the walls. They just watched. And I think that's what still keeps me up at night. The idea that someone could stand in the woods for hours, watching a stranger through the window, completely still, completely quiet, not moving a muscle. Just waiting. For what, I still don't know. And I hope I never find out. It started as a break. Just a regular break from work. I had been working long shifts for the past 7 months straight, most of them being 12-hour days. There was no real vacation in between, and I didn't even go out much. The last movie I saw in theaters was almost a year ago, and I hadn't visited my parents in 6 months. The work was good, but it drained me. I needed to get away, not just a day off or a lazy weekend at home. I needed something quiet, far, away from my phone, from traffic, and most importantly, from people. I started looking for cabins about a month before I planned to take the break. I didn't want a popular one or one close to a town. I looked for something deep in the woods, far from any neighbors. I found one listing that wasn't on any of the bigger booking sites. It was a basic one-room cabin with a kitchen and a bathroom. There was no Wi-Fi, and it mentioned limited cell service. It was about 3.5 hours away from where I lived, up in the hills, near a lake that didn't even have a name on Google Maps. The place had a few photos, just enough to show the inside and the general area, and a short description. The guy renting it out said he kept it for hunters, but it was open year-round. I paid for 5 nights. I left on a Tuesday morning. I packed everything I needed: some canned food, dry snacks, bottled water, clothes, a knife, flashlight, my sleeping bag, even though the cabin supposedly had a bed, and a bunch of batteries. I didn't want to rely on anything that might run out or break. The road got narrower the closer I got to the place. Eventually, it turned into a gravel path surrounded by trees. The last 10 minutes of the drive were just thick forest on both sides, and my GPS stopped working before I even saw the cabin. When I got there, it was exactly how I imagined it. Just a small wooden building with a slanted metal roof, a front porch, and an old bench. There were some rusty tools lying around the side, like a hatchet and a shovel, but nothing fancy. It was quiet. Not a single car had passed me since I got off the main road. No sign of people, just trees and the occasional sound of wind passing through the branches. The key was supposed to be under a flat rock near the steps. I found it quickly and unlocked the front door. Inside, it was plain and dark with just one main room. The bed was pushed to one side, a tiny kitchen set up on the other, with a small fridge, a stove that looked like it ran on propane, and some shelves filled with mismatched cups and plates. There was a bathroom in the back, and it had running water, cold only, but I didn't care. The windows were small, square, and thick with dust. I could see out, but barely. I unpacked and took a short walk around the area. There were no trails, no tire marks, no signs that anyone had been there recently. It felt good to finally be somewhere that wasn't buzzing with people or noise. For the first time in a while, I didn't feel like I had to keep checking my phone. I shut it off and left it inside. That night, I made some noodles on the stove, sat on the porch for an hour, and then went to bed early. I slept surprisingly well. The second day, I explored a little farther. There was a small path down to the lake, maybe a 5-minute walk through the trees. It was still and clear like glass. I sat there for hours, throwing small rocks in and watching the ripples. I didn't think about anything. No emails, no deadlines, just the sound of water and wind. I saw a few deer tracks near the shore, maybe raccoons or something, but no people tracks. That was what I liked the most, no people. Back at the cabin that night, I heard a few strange noises in the woods. Twigs snapping, something moving around, but I figured it was just animals. I wasn't worried. I had my knife and the doors had locks. Besides, who would come all the way out here? By the third day, I settled into a rhythm. I'd wake up with the light, cook something small, go to the lake, come back, read from an old book I brought, then sit outside until it got dark. I had no reason to be afraid. There was nothing out there. But that night, something changed. Something that didn't make sense at first. I noticed a noise in the cabin that I hadn't heard before. It was faint. A soft clicking sound, like a tap or a scratch, came from near the kitchen. I turned on my flashlight and looked around. Nothing. I thought maybe it was a mouse, so I moved some of the old boxes stacked near the fridge. Nothing came out, no droppings, nothing chewed. But the clicking sound didn't go away. It stopped when I was close, but started again later when I went back to bed. The next morning, I heard it again, this time while I was brushing my teeth in the small bathroom. A short click-click. I followed it and tried to trace where it was coming from. I pulled the fridge away from the wall. Dust, spider webs, and one small plastic box that wasn't plugged into anything. It looked like a motion detector, the kind used in security systems. I picked it up. No wires, just a blinking red light on the side and a tiny camera lens facing outward. There was no mention of this in the cabin listing. No cameras, no surveillance. I checked every wall, the corners of the ceiling, even under the bed. I found 2 more similar devices. One was tucked behind a shelf, facing the bed. Another was wedged between the firewood stacked beside the stove. I didn't like it. I set all 3 on the table and just stared at them for a while. They were battery-powered. No company logo, no markings. They weren't connected to anything visible, so I couldn't even tell if they were recording or transmitting. I wanted to believe they were old and broken. Maybe someone had put them in there years ago and forgot. But they were blinking, active. I packed my bag. I didn't feel safe anymore. The idea that someone had been watching me didn't sit right. I even felt weird just being in the room with those little devices. But as I stepped outside, something stopped me. A realization. I had turned off my phone when I got there. It was still off. That meant nobody could track me through it. The only way someone would know I was there, and know exactly where I was in the cabin, would be if they had come there themselves, recently, and placed those devices. I walked around the cabin, checked the trees, looked for anything unusual. About 30 feet behind the cabin, hidden in the brush, I found boot prints. Not mine, bigger than mine. Deep in the dirt like someone had been standing there for a while. I went back inside and locked the door. That night, I stayed awake in bed with my knife next to me. I didn't hear anything outside, but I didn't sleep either. The woods felt different. The silence wasn't comforting anymore. Every sound made me freeze. Every gust of wind felt like a footstep. Around 3 a.m., I thought I saw a shadow through the window. I didn't move. I waited and waited, and eventually, it faded. Could have been a tree swaying. Could have been nothing. I didn't stay for the 5th night. Early the next morning, I packed everything and got out. I didn't even eat. I didn't clean. I didn't leave a note. I drove fast and didn't stop until I hit pavement again. When I finally got signal, I turned on my phone and tried to call the guy who rented the place. The number was out of service. Later that week, I did a reverse image search on the photos from the cabin listing. None of them were original. They were taken from different sites, edited, flipped. Some came from old real estate pages. That place hadn't been listed officially anywhere. It was just put online by someone, and I had taken the bait. I kept the small cameras. I turned one over and forced it open with a screwdriver. There was no memory card, just a small transmitter board inside and a power cell. That meant it had been sending data somewhere. I moved apartments the next month, changed my number, got a new phone. I didn't sleep right for a while, and for weeks I kept checking the corners of my room, the ceiling, under the furniture. It's been over 6 months since that trip, and I still don't know who put those cameras in that cabin, or how long they had been there, or what exactly they saw. I never went to the police because nothing happened. Technically, I wasn't hurt, I wasn't robbed, but someone was watching me, and they were close. Closer than I ever want to think about again. I stopped going out into the woods after that. And the worst part is, sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear I hear that same quiet clicking sound. I don't like thinking about what happened that week. I try to keep my mind busy during the day, and when I lie down at night, I make sure I'm tired enough to fall asleep quickly so I don't have to think about it. But sometimes it creeps in anyway, especially when it's quiet. That's when I see it again in my mind. The trees, the blood, the silence, and the way the wind stopped blowing like it didn't want to be part of what happened. I took the trip to clear my head. I wasn't running from anything dramatic. I didn't just go through a breakup. I didn't lose anyone. I just needed time. Too many screens, too many cars, too many people talking all the time about nothing. It felt like my mind was always buzzing, even when I was home alone. I found the cabin online. It wasn't anything special, just a basic wooden structure a few hours away from town, surrounded by thick trees and built right near the edge of a wide clearing. There were no other houses around, and the nearest town was 25 minutes away by car. The ad said it had running water, a small gas heater, and solar-powered lights. That was enough for me. I didn't want luxury. I just wanted quiet. I got there around noon on a cloudy Monday. The drive was smooth, and the directions were clear. There was a long gravel road that curved through dense forest before finally opening up to the clearing where the cabin sat. It looked just like the pictures. Small porch, dark wood, one window facing the clearing, one door. The place looked old but sturdy. The air was cool and smelled like pine and dirt. I stood there for a moment and just breathed. Inside, it was simple. One room with a bed, a wooden table, a small gas stove, and a metal sink. The bathroom was basically an outhouse off to the side of the property. There were 2 solar-powered lanterns and a box of backup candles. A narrow staircase led to a tiny loft above the main room, where there was another mattress. I dropped my backpack, stretched out on the bed, and listened to the wind in the trees. I didn't check my phone. I didn't want to. The first day was calm. I unpacked my stuff, took a short walk through the clearing, and made some basic dinner with the canned food I brought. I sat on the porch afterward with a blanket over my shoulders and watched the trees sway. That night, it rained. The sound of water on the roof put me right to sleep. The second day, I hiked deeper into the woods behind the cabin. I marked my trail with pieces of cloth tied to low branches. I brought a small folding knife, a flashlight, a bottle of water, and some trail mix. The trees were thick, and the forest floor was soft and damp with fallen leaves. I didn't see any big animals, just a few squirrels and some birds. At one point, I found a broken-down hunting stand half swallowed by the forest. The wood was rotting and covered in moss. I climbed up just to see the view. It was nothing but trees in every direction. No roads, no houses, no smoke, no fences. I got back to the cabin before sunset. Ate, cleaned up, read an old book I found on the shelf. Then I slept. That night, I woke up to a sound outside. It was a deep scraping noise, like something heavy being dragged slowly across the ground. I sat up, my heart thumping. The sound didn't last long. It faded into nothing. I told myself it could have been a branch falling or a rock sliding. But still, I didn't sleep well after that. On the third day, things started feeling off. When I went out to the clearing in the morning, I noticed the grass near the porch had been flattened in a wide curve. It looked like something had passed through during the night, something big. There were no clear footprints, just a path of bent and broken stalks leading from the woods to the back of the cabin. I checked around the building but didn't find anything else strange. I told myself again it could have been a deer, maybe a bear. I wasn't an expert, but then I saw something that made me stop. On the doorframe of the outhouse, about 5 feet up, there were long scratches, 4 parallel lines deep into the wood. They weren't old either. The wood around the edges was pale and fresh. I stared at them for a long time. I didn't have an answer. That afternoon, I stayed close to the cabin. I kept the folding knife in my pocket and listened more than I moved. Every small sound caught my attention. The wind in the leaves, the creak of the wood, a sudden rustle off in the trees. My stomach was tight. I wanted to leave, but I told myself I was overreacting. At dusk, I was inside reading when I heard something outside again. Not the dragging sound from before. This was softer, more careful, like footsteps, slow, deliberate. My hand went to the knife and I stayed completely still. The sound moved from the side of the cabin to the back. I didn't breathe. Then it stopped. I waited 10 minutes before I moved. I went to the window and looked out, but the light was fading and I couldn't see much. I didn't have curtains, so I blew out the lantern and sat in the dark, holding the knife. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning, I found the back window smeared with something. I thought it was dirt at first, but when I got closer, I realized it was greasy, like something with oil or fat had pressed against the glass. There were faint smudges, like fingers, but they weren't human. They were too wide and the angles were wrong. That was the first time I felt real fear. Not just worry, not unease. Real, tight-chested fear that made my hands shake. I packed my things and loaded them into the car. I planned to leave right away, but the car wouldn't start. The engine clicked but didn't turn over. The lights came on, the battery was fine, but it just wouldn't catch. I tried 3 more times, then sat back in the seat, gripping the steering wheel, feeling the sweat run down my neck. I looked out at the trees and felt like they were watching me. I stayed in the cabin that night. I had no choice. I tried calling for help, but I had no signal. I tried walking up the gravel road, thinking maybe I'd get a bar or two if I got high enough, but nothing. It was like the signal just didn't exist out here. That night, everything changed. I locked the door and moved the table against it. I took the knife and a hammer from the toolbox. I sat with my back against the wall and waited. Around midnight, I heard something moving around the cabin. Not fast, not loud, but steady. Sometimes it scratched at the walls. Sometimes it tapped the glass. I stayed completely still. Then it tried the door. The handle turned once, then again. It jiggled gently, then harder. Then it stopped. I didn't sleep at all. When the sun came up, I walked out with the knife in my hand. The grass around the cabin was flattened in circles, like something had walked around it again and again all night. I went to the car and tried again. Still nothing. I made the decision to walk to the nearest town. It would take hours, but I couldn't stay another night. I packed a bag, grabbed water, my knife, and a flashlight, and headed down the gravel road. I walked for nearly an hour before I saw the tire marks. They weren't mine. They were fresh, heading toward the cabin. I followed them back, confused, and found something that made my heart sink. The tracks ended in the middle of the road. Just stopped. No turnaround. No footprints. No sign of anyone. It was like a truck or car had driven in, then vanished. I ran back to the cabin. I didn't want to be out in the open anymore. That night, the thing came back. It didn't try the door this time. Climbed onto the roof. I heard the wood creak, heard it shift its weight. Then I heard it breathing. Slow, heavy, like something massive. I didn't move. I didn't blink. Then it jumped down and was gone. The next morning, I found the claw marks on the roof. The solar panels had been ripped off. I sat on the porch for hours, knife in my lap, staring at the trees. Then I saw something. Not the thing itself, but a flash of movement between the trees. Something tall, too tall. It didn't move like an animal. It didn't move like a person either. It just shifted, then disappeared. That was the last straw. I left everything behind, my bag, the tools, the food. I just grabbed my water bottle and started walking the road again. This time not stopping for anything. I walked for 6 hours. My legs burned. My throat was dry. Then I saw the tower. A fire tower. Rusty and old, but standing. I climbed it and got a signal. 1 bar. Enough to call 911. I didn't have to explain much. I gave my name, my location as best as I could, and said I needed help. A ranger showed up 2 hours later. He didn't ask questions. Just looked at me, saw the state I was in, and nodded. He drove me back to the station in silence. They towed my car out the next day. Said the ignition coil had been torn apart like someone had yanked it out with a crowbar. They asked if I had done it. I said no. They didn't press. I never went back for my things. I didn't want to, and I never found out what it was. No news stories, no tracks found, no sightings, just me and what I saw. Now I lock every door, even during the day. I don't go camping. I don't take trips alone. And I don't look out the windows at night, because I know it was a Thursday when I drove up to the cabin. I remember because I had taken a few days off from work and planned to stretch it into a long weekend. The cabin wasn't fancy or anything. It was old, plain, small, just 2 rooms and a deck, sitting on a 5-acre plot surrounded by flat fields and patches of woods on the edges. I had bought it a couple of years back, hoping to fix it up slowly and use it for getaways. No TV, no internet, just peace, quiet, and space to breathe. That time of year, late September, was perfect. The bugs were mostly gone, the air was dry, and the leaves hadn't fully fallen yet. I got there around 4 in the afternoon, the sun just beginning to dip. The gravel road that led up to the place was rutted and overgrown, and every time I turned onto it, I had to slow to a crawl to avoid scraping the undercarriage. I had a cooler full of food, a few bags of firewood, some tools, and a couple of folding chairs in the back. I planned to cook, read, and sleep. That was it. I parked the car near the deck, got out, and just stood there for a minute. The breeze was quiet, not a sound. I didn't even hear birds, which struck me as strange, but I brushed it off. Maybe they were just gone for the season. I opened up the cabin, the musty smell of disuse hitting me right away. The place had no electricity, just an old propane stove and a wood-burning stove for heat. I aired it out a bit, opened the shutters, and brought everything inside. I lit a fire early, even though it wasn't that cold. I just liked the sound and the smell of it. I heated up some food from a can, sat on the deck with a blanket, and ate while watching the sun go down across the fields. The land around me was empty. It had that hollow sound, the kind of quiet where you can hear the wind moving through the dry grass. I could see the woods about 300 yards out, the trees barely moving. Nothing stirred. It should have felt peaceful, but it didn't. Something felt heavy. I couldn't put my finger on it. That first night, I went to bed early. The cot I slept on was old and creaky, but it did the job. I left the window cracked open to keep fresh air coming in. I drifted off listening to the creaks of the cabin and the crackle of the last logs in the stove. At some point, I woke up. I had no idea what time it was. There was no clock, but I knew it was deep into the night. The fire had burned out. The room was cold. I couldn't see anything through the window, just darkness. And then I heard it, something outside. It wasn't an animal noise. It wasn't wind. It was a sound like boots crunching across the gravel near the deck. I froze. My heartbeat thumped in my chest. The window was too small and too high to see anything from where I lay. I didn't move. I just listened. For about 10 seconds, it was completely silent. Then another sound. Closer. A soft creak. The wood on the deck. The unmistakable sound of a step. Someone was walking on the deck. I told myself it could have been the cabin settling. Maybe a raccoon. I didn't want to believe it could be a person, not out here. But then the sound came again. Another step. Then another. Slower. Not like someone just passing by. More like someone testing the boards under their feet. Couldn't breathe. I stayed perfectly still. I didn't even dare shift my weight. I waited for the sound of the doorknob turning, or the window being touched, or even just breathing nearby. But nothing came after that. Just silence. After maybe an hour of lying there in the cold and dark, I finally managed to fall asleep again. I don't know how. Maybe my body just shut down from the stress. When I woke up again, it was light out. The sun was low in the sky, maybe 6:30 or 7. I got up and opened the door. The deck looked normal, nothing out of place. I checked the area around the cabin. No footprints, no trash, no damage, just weeds, gravel, and morning dew. I tried to shake it off. I told myself I must have imagined it. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it was just part of being alone out here. Your brain plays tricks on you. I made some breakfast, stretched, and tried to get into a relaxed state of mind. Around midday, I decided to go out into the field. There was a small, overgrown trail that ran down the middle of it, barely visible now, with weeds brushing against my legs as I walked. I went about halfway to the woods, just enough to be away from the cabin but still see it behind me. I laid out a blanket and sat there watching the sky. I had a book in my hands, but I wasn't really reading. That's when I saw him, a man, standing in the field maybe 200 yards off, right near the edge of the trees. He was facing me, still, no movement, just standing, not walking, not waving, not doing anything. He wasn't wearing anything strange, just dark clothes, maybe a jacket. I couldn't make out his face. He wasn't close enough for that, but it was clear he was watching me. I stood up. I didn't wave. I didn't move much. I just stood there waiting to see what he'd do. After a long minute, he turned slowly and walked into the woods. I didn't follow. I went back to the cabin slowly at first, then faster. My hands were shaking by the time I got to the porch. I went inside, locked the door, and checked all the windows. I stayed like that for hours. I didn't eat lunch. I didn't sit down. I just stood near the window watching the field. I didn't see him again that day. That night, I barely slept. I didn't light a fire. I didn't want anything to give away that I was inside. I kept the stove cold and sat in the dark, holding a flashlight and a kitchen knife. Every creak, every gust of wind outside made my stomach drop. At some point in the middle of the night, I heard something again. This time it was more deliberate. Not just footsteps, not just the deck. It sounded like someone testing the doorknob. I couldn't see it from where I was. I was crouched near the stove. The door didn't open, but I heard the soft rattle of the handle. Then silence. Then steps on the gravel. Then nothing. I stayed awake the rest of the night. In the morning, I checked the door. No scratches. No signs of force. Just dirt around the base. I walked a wide circle around the cabin, checking the field. And that's when I found the first thing that made my skin go cold. A single footprint. It was shallow, but visible in the dry dirt near the back corner of the cabin. A man's boot, deep tread, nothing else around it. No second print, no trail, just one boot mark. I went back inside and made a decision. I was going to leave. This wasn't some peaceful retreat anymore. I didn't know what the man wanted or what he was doing out here, but I wasn't about to stick around and find out. I packed everything quickly, throwing it into the back of the car. Right as I was about to leave, I looked back one last time at the woods. He was there again, this time closer, maybe 100 yards off. Same position, same stillness, just watching me. I didn't waste time. I jumped into the car, started it, and drove down the gravel path as fast as I could without wrecking the suspension. I made it back to the main road and didn't stop driving until I was 2 towns away. I called the county sheriff's department later that day. I told them I had seen someone lurking on my property. They said they'd send someone out to check, but I could tell they didn't think it was anything serious. They probably thought I was paranoid, or just some city guy spooked by the country. A few days passed. I stayed in a motel and tried to get some sleep, but my mind kept going back to that figure in the field. I kept imagining what would have happened if I hadn't left. What if I had opened the door that night? What if I had stayed one more day? Finally, I got a call back. A deputy had gone out to the property. They said they didn't find anything. No sign of anyone, no damage to the cabin, nothing strange at all. They chalked it up to a trespasser passing through. That was it. But I knew better. I never went back to that cabin. I sold it within a month. Took a loss on it, but I didn't care. I didn't even go back to get the rest of my stuff. I left the folding chairs, some tools, even a few things in the drawers. It wasn't worth it. Not after what I saw. To this day, I don't know who that man was. I don't know why he was there, or why he was watching me, or why he came back 2 nights in a row. I try not to think about it too much, but sometimes I dream about it. I see the field again. I see the trees. I see that figure standing still, silent, just watching. And in those dreams, I always feel the same thing. Something I couldn't shake even in daylight. He wasn't just passing through. He was waiting. I was tired of the city. The noise, the lights, the people always rushing around like their lives depended on it. I wasn't doing well either. Work had been draining me. I hadn't taken a proper break in years. The pressure kept building up until I felt like I couldn't breathe anymore. So I rented a cabin deep in the northern woods, far from the highways and the buzzing phones. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just told them I needed some time off. It was a small cabin, about 100 miles from the nearest real town. I found it on an old listing website. It looked rough but livable. A man had posted it with barely any description. Just a few blurry photos and a message that it was ideal for someone who wants to disappear for a while. That was exactly what I wanted. I drove there in my old sedan. It was a long, uncomfortable drive with no music because my radio had been dead for years. I passed through a few empty roads, winding through trees so thick they looked like walls of wood. My GPS stopped working halfway there. I had saved a screenshot of the map just in case, and that saved me. By the time I got to the cabin, it was late afternoon. The place was surrounded by thick trees. The clearing around it was barely large enough to park my car. The air smelled damp and earthy, and everything was quiet. Not the kind of quiet you hear in parks, where birds still chirp and wind rustles through leaves. This was a heavier quiet, like the woods were holding their breath. The cabin itself was small, with a front porch that leaned slightly to one side. The wood was old and darkened by weather. A metal chimney stuck out of the roof, and some chopped logs were stacked against the side. I unlocked the door using the key the owner had mailed me in a small envelope. Inside, it was dusty but not messy. One main room, a wood stove in the corner, a small kitchen with a sink and propane burner, a single bedroom, and a small bathroom with an old toilet and a hand-pumped basin. No electricity, no cell signal, no internet. It was exactly what I needed. For the first few days, I just rested. I read some books I brought, sat on the porch, made simple meals, and went to bed early. My body started relaxing. I wasn't checking emails. I wasn't thinking about deadlines. I didn't even care what time it was. I was waking up naturally with the light and going to bed when it got too dark to do anything. I chopped some wood, boiled water from the rain barrel, and took sponge baths. My muscles ached from doing things by hand, but it felt good. I started to sleep deeper. I stopped dreaming. On the 5th day, I woke up earlier than usual. The sky was still a soft blue, and the trees were full of mist. I went out with a thermos of coffee and sat on the porch. I watched the fog move slowly between the trees. That was when I noticed it. There was a narrow line in the grass, behind the cabin, almost hidden. I hadn't seen it before. It looked like a trail, not a hiking path, not a gravel road, but a thin, beaten line through the undergrowth, curved off into the woods. The grass was slightly shorter there, and some bushes had been pushed aside like something had moved through it many times. It was too narrow for a car. It could have been made by deer or other animals, but it looked too clean, too purposeful. I didn't think much of it at first. I finished my coffee, stretched, and went back inside. But that thin line stayed in my head. All day, I found myself glancing out the window toward it. Something about the way it slipped between the trees made it feel like it led to something. Something close, something hidden. By the afternoon, my curiosity got the better of me. I put on my boots, grabbed my flashlight, a small pack with a water bottle and a granola bar, and stepped into the trees behind the cabin. At first, the trail was faint and narrow. I had to duck under some branches and step over thick roots. But the deeper I went, the more defined it became. The bushes along the sides were pushed back. The soil was compact. Someone had walked this path often. Maybe recently. There were no signs, no markings. I didn't hear birds or insects. I only heard the crunch of twigs under my feet and the occasional rustle of leaves as I brushed past them. I kept going, watching the trees press in tighter around me. I had walked maybe 10 minutes when I saw the first sign that something was wrong. It was a piece of rope tied around a tree. Not new, but not old either. It was looped once around the trunk and then cut off. like someone had tied something there and then taken it down quickly. A few feet farther, I saw another piece of rope tied the same way. Then another, like someone had marked the path. But why hide a trail and then mark it? I kept going. The trees grew denser. The air felt colder. My skin started to prickle even though I wasn't cold. The trail turned and dipped into a hollow. The soil changed too. It became damp and sticky, almost muddy. I saw something ahead and froze. There was a structure. Not a cabin. Not a house. More like a shed. It was made of sheet metal and wood, patched together in a crooked shape. There were no windows, just a single wooden door slightly ajar. The place looked abandoned but not ruined, like someone had been there not long ago and then left in a hurry. I don't know why, but I crouched down behind a bush and watched it for a long time. My heart was beating fast, and my hands were sweaty. I couldn't explain it. It wasn't fear. It was more like my instincts were yelling at me. I should have turned around. I should have gone back to the cabin. But I didn't. I moved slowly toward the shed, keeping quiet. I stepped around a puddle and reached the side of the building. I pressed one hand against the wall. It was damp and cold. I leaned close and listened. Nothing. I pushed the door open. The smell hit me first. Rot, sweat, damp cloth. The kind of smell that clings to your throat. Inside, it was dark, but the light from the open door lit up enough. The floor was made of dirt. There was a wooden table in the center, covered in stained tools. Not woodworking tools. These were strange. Bolt cutters, old knives, a hammer, a saw with a bent blade. Ropes hung from nails in the wall. There was a mattress on the floor with dark stains. Buckets in the corner. Empty cans of food. This was no storage shed. Someone had lived here. No, not just lived here. Someone had used this place for something else. Something bad. My body was frozen. My brain kept repeating the same thought. Get out. Get out. Get out now. I backed away slowly and turned. That's when I saw it. A camera. A small one. Mounted in the corner of the ceiling, pointed right at the door. It had a green light. Someone had been watching. I ran. I didn't care about the noise. I just ran. I barreled through the bushes and trees, back up the trail, stumbling over rocks and roots. My breath came in sharp gasps, and my legs started to burn. I reached the cabin, slammed the door, and locked it. I pulled the curtains closed and sat on the floor, back against the wall, trying to calm down. I stayed like that for hours, barely moving. Every little sound made me flinch. I kept thinking someone was going to come through the trees. Someone had been watching that shed. Maybe they were watching the trail. Maybe they'd seen me. That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't light any lamps or use the stove. I just sat in the dark, staring at the door, waiting. The next morning, I packed my things. I didn't care how long I had planned to stay. I wasn't staying another night. I got everything into the car as fast as I could, locked the cabin behind me, and drove. The dirt road felt like it went on forever. Every time I turned a corner, I expected a truck to block the way. I kept glancing in the mirror, sure someone was following me, but no one came. When I got back to the main road and finally saw other cars, my hands were shaking. I drove all the way back to the city in one day. I didn't stop to eat. I didn't stop to rest. I just wanted to be surrounded by people again. When I got home, I tried to forget about it. I didn't tell anyone. Who would I tell? What would I say? I found a shed with some creepy tools and a mattress? That I saw a camera? But the thoughts didn't stop. I kept thinking about that camera. That green light. Someone was watching that place. Someone had set it up for something. Someone might be going back there. Eventually, I did call the local sheriff's office in that area. I gave them the rough location, said I had been hiking and stumbled on an illegal camp. I didn't give my name. I just hung up after that. Weeks passed. I never heard anything on the news. No arrests, no reports. But the worst part? 2 months later, I got a letter. No return address, just my name. Inside was a single photo. It was me, standing in front of that shed, looking inside. Whoever had that camera, they knew I was there. They knew who I was, and they wanted me to know they hadn't forgotten. I don't really like cities. I never did. The noise, the people, the endless distractions, they make me feel trapped. I'm more comfortable when things are quiet, when I can hear the wind blow and birds call out from somewhere high in the trees. That's why I try to get away every winter. I take time off work and go somewhere far from everything. This time, I went a bit farther than usual. I found the listing online. It wasn't even on the popular rental sites. It was just a local website that listed cabins in Montana. The pictures showed an old wooden cabin tucked deep in the forest, about 5 miles from the nearest paved road. There were no neighbors, no cell signal, no electricity. Just a wood stove, a cot, a table, and miles of trees in every direction. The listing said it was good for hunters or loners, and the price was low. That was enough for me. I packed up my old Jeep with everything I thought I'd need. Canned food, a portable stove, a couple of water containers, my winter gear, batteries, lanterns, a sleeping bag, a notebook, and a few books. I left before sunrise on a Sunday morning. The sky was still dark when I hit the road, and the traffic was light. I drove all day, stopped only for gas, and by late afternoon I reached the edge of the forest where the dirt road started. The last 5 miles were slow. The snow was deep in places, and the tires struggled, but the Jeep kept pushing forward. Trees lined the road, their trunks black and stiff like soldiers. After what felt like forever, I saw the cabin come into view. It was small and square, with a steep roof weighed down by snow. There was a stack of chopped wood near the front door, and a tiny porch with a railing that had half fallen off. Everything looked old and worn, but still solid. I liked that. I liked that it felt used. I parked behind the cabin and got out. The cold air slapped my face, and I stood still for a moment, letting it all sink in. No traffic noise, no people, no movement, just quiet. That's what I came for. I took my bags inside, checked the place out. It had only one room and a small storage area behind the kitchen wall. The stove was rusty but worked. There was a small window over the table and another above the bed. The floor creaked, but it felt firm. There were no signs of rats or anything, just dust. That night, I sat by the stove and read a little. I heard the wind outside, and at some point I thought I heard footsteps in the snow. But when I stepped outside with a flashlight, I didn't see anything. Just the prints I had made earlier and smooth snow everywhere else. I figured I was just being jumpy, that it was probably a branch falling or snow shifting from the roof. The first 3 days were peaceful. I read, I wrote in my notebook, I made simple meals, and I went on short walks around the cabin. I didn't go far. I didn't want to risk getting lost in the snow. I stayed within a half-mile radius and marked my tracks with broken twigs just to be sure. The cold was sharp, but I had brought enough warm clothes to manage. It was on the 4th night that things started to feel strange. I was sleeping when I woke up to a faint creaking sound. Not like the usual wood settling kind of sound, but more like a slow step. I sat up and held my breath. I listened. The wind wasn't blowing hard, and the cabin wasn't shaking. I turned off the lantern and waited in the dark, listening to the silence. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it had been a dream or some animal brushing up against the wall outside. In the morning, I looked around. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, checking for tracks in the snow, but there weren't any. Not fresh ones, anyway. I'd already gotten used to seeing my own prints circling the place from the walks I'd taken. Nothing new stood out. That afternoon, I was chopping some firewood behind the cabin when I noticed a vent low on the back wall. It looked like one of those old air vents, rectangular with a metal grate. It was only a few inches off the ground and partially buried under snow. I knelt down and brushed the snow off. The grate had rusted over, and behind it was darkness. I could hear a faint whistle of cold air coming through. I figured it connected to the storage area inside. That night, I started noticing small things out of place. I had left a can opener on the table and found it on the counter. One of the firewood logs I'd stacked by the stove was missing. The lantern I kept on the shelf near the window had been moved slightly, just a few inches. I told myself I probably just misplaced these things without thinking, but the feeling in my stomach said otherwise. Couldn't sleep. I kept getting up and checking the door. It was locked. I checked the window. Still closed. I even opened the storage area in the back. It was just a dark little room with a few hooks on the wall and some cracked shelves. Nothing in there but dust. The next morning, I found footprints. They weren't mine. They were small, lighter, almost like a child's, but too far apart to be a kid's. They started at the back of the cabin, near the vent, and led toward the woods. They were half covered by snow, but still clear enough. I followed them with my eyes, not my feet. I stood there for a long time just looking at them. They didn't come from the woods. They started at the cabin and went away. That meant someone had been inside. I opened the storage door again and stepped inside. I felt around the wall near where the vent would be. Sure enough, there was a little square outline low on the wall, hidden behind a loose board. I pushed on it and felt it give. I pulled the board off, and behind it was an opening. Not big, but large enough for someone thin to squeeze through. It led into the crawl space beneath the floor. My whole body went cold. I dropped the board and backed out of the room. I felt like I was going to be sick. I locked the cabin door, even though I knew that wouldn't help much. Whoever had been in here didn't use the door. They came up through the floor. I didn't know what to do. I had no signal, no way to call for help. My Jeep was still working, but the snow had gotten deeper, and I didn't know if I could drive it back out without chains. I told myself I'd wait until morning. If anything else strange happened during the night, I'd pack up and leave no matter what. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the lantern on and sat in the chair by the stove, facing the back room. I held a fire poker in one hand and my hunting knife in the other. Around 3 a.m., I heard something shift under the floor. Just a faint scrape, like nails on wood. I didn't move. I just listened. Then I heard it again, closer this time. I got up slowly and walked to the storage room. I stood there, staring at the open panel. I could hear breathing. I swear I could. Shallow, slow breathing. I raised the lantern and shined it into the crawl space. The beam caught a shape, a human shape, curled up against the wall just inside the crawl space. They flinched at the light and backed away, deeper into the shadows. I didn't say anything. I just slammed the panel shut and pushed the shelves against it. I stayed awake the rest of the night. By morning, I had a plan. I didn't know who was living down there or for how long, but I wasn't about to stay another night. I packed everything as fast as I could. I kept the fire poker with me the whole time. I didn't eat. I didn't rest. I threw everything into the Jeep, started the engine, and just prayed it would get me out. It did, but barely. The Jeep struggled in the deep snow. I felt the tires spin more than once, but it kept going. I didn't stop driving until I reached the highway. I didn't stop even then. I drove all the way back to town, booked a motel room, and locked the door. That night, I finally called the sheriff's office. I told them what I found. They didn't believe me at first, but I gave them the address, the pictures I had taken of the footprints, the vent, and the open panel. 2 days later, they called me back. They found signs of someone living down there. Blankets, cans of food, wrappers, a small mattress pad, and some old tools. There was even a burner phone and a journal. The person had cleared out before they got there, but there was no doubt someone had been staying under the cabin for a while, possibly for months. They still don't know who it was. They think it might have been a drifter, maybe someone squatting during the winter. But the strange thing is, there were no signs of forced entry. No one reported break-ins nearby. Whoever it was, they had picked that cabin specifically and stayed completely hidden until I showed up. I think about it a lot. I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't found that panel. If I had stayed a few more nights. If I had let my guard down. I wonder how many nights they watched me from beneath the floor. I wonder if they had planned to hurt me, or if they were just trying to survive in their own quiet way. I'll never know, but I haven't gone back to the woods since. Not alone. Not in winter. Not ever. It was a Wednesday when I decided to take a break from everything and get away for a while. Work had been pushing me too hard. I was spending almost 12 hours a day in front of a screen, and my head would pound by the end of each night. I was tired of the city, tired of the constant noise, traffic, and pressure. So I packed my car and drove out toward the hills, following a recommendation from a coworker who had told me about an old cabin his uncle used to rent out. It was far out in the woods, no cell service, no people around, nothing but trees, trails, and silence. That sounded perfect to me. I didn't even ask too many questions. I was just told where to find the key, under a rock near the front steps, and that the place hadn't been used in a while. I liked that. I wanted isolation. I didn't want to be near anyone. I just wanted to sit, walk, read, and rest. Maybe write something if I felt like it. I had this idea that I'd finally relax, finally slow down, finally breathe again. It was a long drive, nearly 6 hours from the city. The last 2 hours were on a narrow road with no signs, the trees closing in tightly from both sides. There were stretches where I didn't see a single car. Then I turned off onto a dirt path that wound deeper into the woods. The road was rough and uneven, the tires kicking up dust and loose rock. My small sedan didn't handle it well, but it made it. When I finally saw the cabin, I felt a small wave of relief. It was simple, old, a single-story wooden structure, sitting just a little back from the tree line. The roof was slanted and partly covered in moss. The steps up to the front door sagged slightly in the middle. One of the windows had a crack running diagonally across it. There was no driveway, just a flat patch of ground where I parked the car. Everything looked worn and forgotten, like it had been sitting there for years with no one caring for it. That was exactly what I wanted. I got out of the car, stretched my legs, walked up to the front steps, and found the key just like I'd been told, under a rock to the left. I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The air was stale and smelled like old wood and dust. There was no electricity, just oil lamps and candles. A wood stove sat in one corner, and an old table with 2 wooden chairs was near the window. A rusted sink and some open shelves with cans and utensils made up the small kitchen area. The floor creaked with every step. There was one bedroom with a thin mattress and 2 itchy-looking blankets, and a bathroom with a bucket shower setup and a composting toilet. Still, it was peaceful. No humming of appliances, no screens, just quiet. The wind barely moved through the trees. No birds, no cars, no voices. I unpacked slowly. Just a few clothes, some canned food, a camping stove, my journal, and a few books. I didn't bring much. I planned to stay for 5 days. I figured that was enough. I could go on a few hikes, sleep in, eat when I wanted, and not speak a word to anyone. That first day passed without anything strange. I lit a fire in the stove and made some soup. I read a bit, wrote in my journal. The night came quickly, and the woods went completely dark. The kind of dark you don't really see in the city. A thick, heavy black. I lit one of the oil lamps and lay down on the bed. The mattress was rough, the springs poking up at odd spots, but I was tired and didn't care. I fell asleep fast. Around midnight, I woke up to a loud snap. Something outside. It wasn't just a branch falling. It sounded like wood being stepped on. Something heavy. I sat up in bed, my heart already beating faster than normal. I waited. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. There was nothing else. Just silence again. I told myself it was probably an animal. A deer. Maybe a raccoon. It was the woods after all. I hadn't stayed in a place this remote in years. I was probably just on edge from how quiet it was. Still, I stayed awake for a long time, listening. The next morning, I went outside to look. I didn't see anything. No tracks, no sign of anything moving around. The ground was hard and dry. Maybe I had imagined it. Or maybe it had just been a small animal. I let it go. I walked a few trails that day, wandered deeper into the trees. I came across an old hunting blind nailed high in a tree. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. There was a ladder missing the bottom 3 rungs. I walked past it. The deeper I went, the less I saw anything that looked touched by people. No wrappers, no footprints, no beer cans. Just trees, rocks, and moss. When I got back to the cabin that afternoon, I noticed something weird. The front door was open. I knew I had closed it. I always close doors. It's a habit, especially out here where there are animals, whether insects. But the door was wide open, slowly creaking in the breeze. I stood still for a while, just watching it, listening. I couldn't hear anything. I walked up slowly, looked around the cabin before stepping inside. Nothing looked disturbed. My bag was where I left it. My books were still stacked on the table. The firewood pile was untouched, but I still felt like something was off. I had this tight feeling in my chest, like someone had been in there, or maybe was still in there. I checked the closet, under the bed, behind the curtain in the bathroom. Nothing. I told myself maybe the wind had pushed it open. Maybe the door didn't latch properly. That seemed reasonable. I checked the lock. It was loose. The latch didn't catch cleanly unless you pulled hard. That must have been it. I told myself that, even though deep down it didn't sit right. That night I had trouble sleeping. I kept thinking about the door, about that snapping sound the night before, about how quiet everything was. Too quiet. The kind of quiet where you feel like something's watching. Around 2 a.m., I heard another noise. This time it was clearer. A dragging sound, then a dull thump, like something heavy being pulled across the porch. I froze again. I didn't move. I stared at the ceiling and waited. The dragging stopped, then nothing. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I just laid there, eyes open, the oil lamp still burning on the floor next to the bed. I didn't hear anything else. In the morning, I opened the front door and looked down. There was a long scratch across the wooden floorboards, like something had been dragged across them. A single deep line, straight across the porch. I followed it to the left, but it disappeared into the dirt. I looked for footprints again. Nothing, just that one long scratch. Something was wrong. I wanted to leave. That was my first real thought. I knew something wasn't right out here, but I had told myself I was going to spend 5 days. And part of me still wanted to believe I was imagining things, that I was just too used to the city, that being alone was making my mind create problems that weren't really there. I stayed. I shouldn't have. That third day, I stayed near the cabin. I didn't want to go far. I checked the perimeter again. I looked for trail cams or signs of other people. Nothing, but I kept feeling eyes on me, like someone was close, just out of view. That night, I pushed the table against the door. I also wedged a chair under the handle just in case. I didn't light the lamp. I didn't want any light to give away where I was inside. I lay on the bed in the dark, listening again, waiting. This time the noise came closer to 3 a.m. It started with a creak, then footsteps, slow, heavy, not boots, not fast, just steady, one step at a time, across the porch, toward the door, then nothing. I didn't breathe. I stared at the ceiling, heart pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. I waited. Minutes passed. Then a soft knock. Not loud, not rushed, just 3 slow knocks. Then nothing. I didn't sleep at all that night. In the morning, the table was still pressed against the door. The chair was still wedged under the handle, but there were fresh scuff marks on the floor, like boots dragging slightly. I opened the door and looked around. There were indentations in the dirt that looked like partial footprints, but they were too messy to follow, too scattered. I started packing. I didn't care about the 5-day plan anymore. I didn't care about the peace and quiet or the break from work. I wanted to leave. I needed to leave. I got in the car and started driving. That was the first good moment I'd had in days, just getting away from that place. But it didn't last. About 2 miles down the dirt path, my tire blew out. I stopped the car and got out. The rear right tire was shredded, not just flat, torn. The rubber was sliced open like someone had taken a blade to it. I checked the other tires. They were fine. I looked around. Nothing but trees. No sign of movement. I unlocked the trunk and got the spare. But the spare had a huge crack in the rim, like someone had taken a hammer to it. That's when I knew, without any doubt, that someone didn't want me to leave. I sat in the car for over an hour, not knowing what to do. No phone service, no GPS, no way to call for help. I could walk. I needed a break from people. Too many days sitting in traffic, too many screens, too many shallow conversations, and too much stress. I had this small cabin handed down from my uncle after he passed. It was nothing fancy, just one room, a wood stove, a basic kitchenette, and a bed. No internet, no electricity, no cell service. It sat on the far end of a patch of forest in northern Montana, not far from the Canadian border. I'd only been there once before, years ago, and that time I didn't stay more than a night. But this time I was planning to stay alone for a week. No distractions, just me, the trees, and quiet. The drive took a full day. The last few hours were rough, narrow dirt roads, sharp turns, and no signs for miles. I got to the cabin just before sunset. It looked older than I remembered. The wood had gone gray, the porch was slightly slanted, and some of the railing was missing. Still, it was standing. That was enough. I parked the truck just off the edge of the clearing and unpacked everything: food, sleeping bag, axe, water jugs, a few tools, and a shotgun I brought just in case of bears. I checked around before settling in. The front door still had a working lock, though I didn't think I'd need it. Inside was dusty but intact. There were old canned goods on a shelf, most rusted and expired. A few spider webs in the corners. Some leftover firewood sat next to the iron stove. The windows were cloudy with dust but not broken. I swept the floor with an old broom and wiped the counters. Took maybe 30 minutes to make it livable. By the time I lit the first fire and sat down on the bed, night had fallen outside. That first night was peaceful. I could hear the wind moving through the trees and the occasional creak of the wooden walls. I slept better than I had in months. No buzzing phones, no cars, just dark silence and the crackle of the fire. I woke up with the sun coming through the dusty windows. The air inside was cold, my breath visible, but I felt good. I put on a thick jacket and went out to split more firewood for the day. There was a rhythm to it all. Chop wood, keep the fire going, boil water, heat up simple meals. I read some old books I brought. I took long walks through the woods, following the old game trails, stopping to listen to birds, squirrels, the occasional deer moving through brush. I didn't see any other signs of people, just animal tracks and fallen trees. I stayed close to the cabin. I knew the land stretched for miles in every direction, but I didn't want to get lost. I didn't bring a GPS. By the third day, I had fallen into a slow, quiet routine. It was calm, even a little boring, but in a good way. I kept a small fire going in the stove most of the day. I used melted snow for water. I rationed food carefully. There was plenty if I stayed disciplined. I slept early, woke up with the sun, and spent most of the daylight outside, just walking or sitting with my back against a tree. Everything was fine until the fourth day. That morning I woke up and stepped outside to take a leak like usual. I walked out a bit past the porch, stood behind the woodshed, and then saw something odd. A boot print in the snow. It wasn't mine. I checked. My boots had thick lugs. These were flatter, narrower, like a hiking boot. More importantly, they were fresh. There'd been a light snowfall during the night. These prints were clean and deep, clearly made after the snow stopped. That meant someone had walked through here while I was asleep. My heart started to race. I looked around. There were no other tracks near them, just one set, walking along the tree line maybe 20 feet away from the cabin, heading from the north and continuing past into the deeper woods. No prints came toward the cabin, only past it. I tried to calm myself. Could be a hiker, maybe someone hunting, but it was strange. This area wasn't near any trails, and I would have heard a snowmobile or truck. There were no tire tracks, no engine sounds the night before, and who hikes in pitch dark, in fresh snow without a trail? Still, I tried to ignore it. I spent the day close to the cabin. I kept the shotgun loaded and near the door. I didn't like the feeling in my gut. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept the fire low and listened hard for any noises. Every creak of the trees or pop of ice outside made me jump. But the night passed quietly. No sounds, no movement, just cold wind. In the morning, I checked again. No new tracks, just the old ones already starting to fade in the sunlight. I told myself maybe it had just been a hunter passing through, someone who didn't even see the cabin. But that didn't explain what I found that evening. I was gathering more firewood behind the shed, dragging small logs into a pile, when I noticed something stuck between the planks near the bottom of the wall. It looked like paper. I bent down and pulled it out. It was a torn page from a book. Old, yellowed with water stains. The paragraph was visible, but the words didn't make sense. It had nothing to do with the cabin, some fiction about a war or something, but someone had torn it out and wedged it in there. That made no sense. I hadn't brought any books like that. I checked mine, they were all intact. This page didn't match, and it hadn't been there before. I was sure. I checked the area carefully now. I circled the shed. I looked for more prints, more signs. Nothing. Just more trees and snow and silence. I stayed inside the rest of that night. I kept the shotgun next to my bed. I didn't light a fire. I didn't want the smoke to show. I didn't even light the lantern. I ate cold food in the dark and listened. Around 2 in the morning, I thought I heard crunching, like boots in snow, but it was faint, maybe 50 yards out. I held my breath and listened. Came again, crunch, pause, crunch. Then silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. The 6th day, I woke up sore, tired, and on edge. I checked all around the cabin first thing. No new tracks. Nothing by the shed. Nothing out in the woods. But something felt wrong, like I was being watched. That kind of pressure in the back of your neck when you know someone's staring, even if you can't see them. I took the shotgun and hiked a slow circle around the clearing, maybe 200 feet out. I didn't see anything, but I saw a crow fly off fast from a tree near the ridge. That was the only sign of movement. When I got back to the cabin, I saw it. There was a new boot print. One single print, this time on the porch, right in front of the door. Just one. My own prints were around it, scuffed, older, but this one was deep, clean. It hadn't been there when I left. Someone had come to the porch while I was gone, and just stood there. No knock, no tracks leading away, just the one print, like they wanted me to know. That was the last straw. I packed everything I could into my bag. I threw on my coat, strapped the shotgun to my back, and got into the truck. The snow was shallow, and the truck was 4-wheel drive. I started it up, praying it wouldn't stall. The engine rumbled to life. I backed up and turned toward the path that led out. It was narrow and winding, but I didn't care. I just wanted to leave. I made it maybe half a mile before I had to stop. A tree had fallen across the road. It was fresh. The cut marks weren't from wind or rot. It had been chopped, clean, axed at both ends. Someone had dropped this thing deliberately. It was too big to move alone, at least 2 feet thick and 30 feet long. There were no tracks around it, no footprints, but I knew now I wasn't alone out there. I threw the truck into reverse, backed all the way to the cabin, and shut off the engine. I didn't know what else to do. It was getting late. I didn't want to run through the woods at night. I thought maybe I could try to clear the tree in the morning, maybe use a winch or saw it apart slowly. But I didn't sleep that night either. I kept the fire low and sat near the door with the shotgun across my lap. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps, but this time closer. Crunch, crunch. They circled the cabin. I heard slow steps move past the front wall, then the side, then around the back, then silence. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I sat there until the sky turned gray and the birds started to sing. When morning came, I checked outside. All around the cabin, I saw them. Dozens of boot prints, just pacing, circling, like someone walking in slow loops all night. No trash, no sign of a campsite, no sign of a person, just tracks. I didn't wait. I took the axe and the saw from the shed. I hiked the mile back to the tree. Took 4 hours, but I managed to clear part of it, just enough to squeeze the truck past. I got back, loaded everything fast, and left before noon. I didn't stop until I hit the main road 5 hours later. Once I had signal again, I called the nearest sheriff's office. I told them what I found. They said they'd send someone to check, but I never got a follow-up. I never went back. I sold the cabin 6 months later. I never explained why, just listed it cheap and took the first offer. Sometimes I still think about those footprints, about the page in the wall. The road past the last gas station was rough and broken, with gravel in places and deep potholes where the old asphalt had peeled off in wide patches. I kept the window down for most of the trip because my AC had been giving me problems for weeks. and every few miles the warm forest air would give way to cooler patches, carrying the sharp smell of pine and wet leaves. My phone signal had dropped off about 40 minutes before I even reached the turnoff point onto the smaller dirt road that led deeper into the woods. I knew that part would happen, and to be honest, that was the whole point. I wanted to get away from everything for a while. The cabin belonged to a friend of a friend. I had never been there before, but I'd seen pictures. It was about 40 years old, sitting on about 10 acres of wooded land, with no neighbors in sight. It had no Wi-Fi, no TV, and no cell service unless you hiked up the steep hill to the west, where you could sometimes get 1 or 2 bars. I had brought some books, a couple of flashlights, and enough food and water for the week. My plan was simple: read, relax, maybe write in the journal I had brought, sleep as much as I wanted, and listen to the quiet. When I finally got to the cabin, the sun was already dipping behind the trees. The place was smaller than it had looked in the pictures. It was a 1-story structure, made of faded gray wood and built on a short foundation with a small porch out front. The porch was old but solid, and a rusted metal chair sat to one side, half covered in pine needles. A stack of chopped firewood was leaning against the wall by the front door, and the windows were all closed. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and dust. There was a small wood stove against the far wall, an old love seat in the middle of the room, and a tiny kitchen with a chipped tile counter and a miniature fridge that ran on propane. The bedroom was off to the left, a small room with a narrow bed, a dresser, and a single window that looked out into the trees behind the cabin. I walked through slowly, checking each corner, opening each drawer. Everything was clean and exactly the way it should be. Nothing felt off. Not yet. That first night was quiet. I made a small dinner, canned soup and crackers, and sat on the porch with a blanket over my legs. I listened to the wind move through the trees and the occasional chirp of a bird or rustle of leaves. It was dark, darker than I had imagined. I had a flashlight, but I didn't want to waste the batteries. The moon wasn't very strong, so the forest beyond the little clearing the cabin sat in felt like a wall of blackness. I couldn't see past the first few rows of trees. It was strange, but not scary. I was used to camping. I was used to being alone, but there was something about that night, or maybe it was just something in the air. Around 11, I heard a noise from behind the cabin. It wasn't loud, just the sound of dry leaves being stepped on. I stood still and waited. A few seconds later, I heard it again. Came in slow, irregular patterns, like someone walking slowly, stopping, then walking again. I stood there on the porch, barely breathing. I stared toward the back of the cabin, but I couldn't see anything beyond the tree trunks and the shadows. After a minute, the sound stopped. I waited another 10 minutes before going inside and locking the door. The next morning, I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe a raccoon. I went outside and looked around the back of the cabin. There were no tracks in the dirt, but the dry leaves had definitely been disturbed. It didn't mean much. It was fall. The ground was covered in leaves. Anything could have moved through there. I stood still for a while and listened, but the woods were quiet. Still, the wind wasn't blowing. Nothing moved. That day, I tried to stick to my original plan. I read a bit, then sat out on a blanket with some food and watched the clouds move overhead. I didn't think about the sounds from the night before. Not really, but I didn't wander far either. I kept close to the cabin. By the second night, something had changed. I went to bed early, maybe around 10. I was lying there in the small bedroom with the window cracked open when I started to feel like something was off again. At first, I didn't hear anything. I just had that weird sensation, you know, the one, like someone's watching you. I turned and looked out the window. Nothing but black trees and soft wind moving the branches. I waited. I told myself I was just overthinking it. Then I heard it again. This time, it wasn't behind the cabin. It was out in front, somewhere near the edge of the clearing. It was the same sound, dry leaves, slow footsteps. It would go silent for a while, then start again. I lay there, still as I could, my heart beating heavy in my chest. I didn't move. I didn't even reach for the flashlight. I just waited. After maybe 20 minutes, it stopped. The next day, I started thinking more seriously about what it could be. I checked all around the cabin again. Nothing. No tracks, no signs of animals, no broken branches or signs of anything big moving around. I walked a little way into the trees, maybe 30 or 40 feet, but something about going deeper made me uneasy. I felt like I shouldn't be out there alone. It wasn't a fear I could explain. It was just a heavy feeling, like I was being watched again. That evening, I didn't sit on the porch. I stayed inside with the stove burning and kept a flashlight in each room. I even put a knife from the kitchen drawer next to the bed. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. I just lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, trying to breathe slowly and stay calm. Then, just after midnight, I heard it again. This time it was closer, much closer. The footsteps were right outside the bedroom window. I could hear the crunch of the dry leaves, slow and heavy. There was a long pause, then another step, another pause, then 2 steps, one after the other, like someone had shifted their weight or changed direction. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just stared at the dark ceiling, listening. My throat was dry. I didn't even want to look out the window. After a while, the footsteps moved off again. I waited almost an hour before I fell asleep. The next morning, I told myself this had to stop. Either someone was messing with me, or there was an animal coming around every night. I checked around the cabin again, looking for signs, anything. Still nothing, not even a broken twig. I tried calling out with my emergency walkie, but no one answered. I couldn't get a signal unless I hiked out. By that afternoon, I was starting to get angry. Angry at myself for being scared. Angry at whatever was out there. I decided I was going to stay up all night and wait. If something came, I'd be ready. I made coffee late in the evening and brought the chair inside from the porch. I sat in the main room with the stove lit and both flashlights on the table next to me. The knife was tucked into my hoodie pocket. I didn't turn off the lights. I wanted to see everything. It was around 2 in the morning when I saw something move. Through the small front window, I saw it. A figure, just a shape, standing between the trees. It didn't move. It was maybe 30 feet away. It wasn't big, just tall enough to be a person. No flashlight, no phone screen glow, nothing, just standing there. I stood up slowly and grabbed the flashlight. I turned it on and pointed it at the window. The beam hit the glass and lit up the clearing, but by the time my eyes adjusted, the figure was gone. I stepped back, heart racing. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't going to go outside. Not a chance. I waited by the window for an hour. Nothing else moved. The next morning, I packed my things. I couldn't stay there. I hadn't seen a face or heard a voice, but I knew I wasn't alone out there. Someone was out there and they were watching me. They never approached. They never tried to break in or leave a message or anything like that. They just stood there, moved around, watched. I hiked up the western hill with my bag and finally got 1 bar of signal. I texted my friend and told him I was cutting the trip short. I hiked back down, loaded up the car, and left without looking back. I didn't tell anyone else about it for a long time. There was no proof, no damage, nothing stolen, just a series of strange nights, footsteps in the dark, and a figure watching from the trees. Whoever it was, they didn't want to talk. They didn't want to hurt me either, but they wanted me to know they were there, and that was enough. I never went back to that cabin. I still don't sleep well in silence. I need background noise, a fan, a TV, something. If it's too quiet, I start thinking about those footsteps again. The slow crunch of leaves, the still figure between the trees. I had been working nonstop for almost 9 months. Projects, deadlines, late nights, and a lot of stress. I barely had time to sleep properly, let alone go on a break. It was all getting too much, and I could feel it wearing me down. I didn't want to see people, hear traffic, or even check my phone anymore. I needed something quiet, away from everything. I found this small cabin rental online. It was far out in the woods, about 5 hours from my city, and seemed perfect. No neighbors, no cell signal, just trees, a lake nearby, and silence. The pictures showed a basic wooden cabin with a tin roof, an old shed out back, and a large fire pit. No fancy stuff, just what I wanted. I packed my things early that Friday morning. Just essentials, clothes, some food, a flashlight, a knife, a lighter, and a few books. I brought 2 gallons of water too, just in case the tap water was bad. The drive was long but nice. The roads became more narrow as I got closer, with fewer houses and more trees. The GPS led me through some dirt roads until it finally told me I had arrived. The cabin was just off a gravel trail, surrounded by dense woods. It looked older than in the pictures, but I didn't mind. It was quiet, peaceful. I got out of the car and took a deep breath. The air smelled like pine and dirt. No cars, no sirens, no voices, just birds and the wind. I unlocked the cabin door and went inside. It was small, just a living space, a kitchen area, a bedroom and a bathroom, old wooden floors, a dusty couch, a table, and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The bedroom had a small bed, just a mattress on a wooden frame. I dropped my bag and walked around to get a feel of the place. There were spider webs in the corners and dust on the windowsills, but nothing too bad. Behind the cabin was the shed. It looked like it hadn't been opened in years. The wood was dark and split in places, and the door was crooked. I tried to open it, but it was locked with a rusted padlock. I figured it just had old tools or firewood. Didn't think much about it. That first night, I sat by the fire pit and made some food on my little camping stove. It got cold quickly after sunset. I wrapped myself in a hoodie and watched the fire until it burned down. I went inside, locked the door, and read a bit before falling asleep. No sounds but crickets. The second day, I hiked around the area. There was a small path behind the cabin that led down toward the lake. I followed it and found a quiet little shore with large rocks. I sat there for a while, watching the water and listening to the wind. I didn't see a single person the whole time. I liked that. When I got back to the cabin, it was just past noon. I made some lunch and took a nap. That evening, I walked around the back of the cabin again, just looking around. Something about the shed bothered me. I didn't know why. Maybe it was just how old and forgotten it looked. The lock was still there. I tried the door again, but it didn't budge. I circled around it. There was a small window on the side, but it was covered with some kind of cloth or plastic from the inside. Couldn't see in. I heard something rustle nearby and looked toward the trees, but I didn't see anything. Just the wind, I told myself. That night, I heard a thump. Came from the back side of the cabin. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. I waited. Nothing else. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening. Another thump. Closer this time. Maybe something fell from a tree, I thought. I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and slowly walked to the back window. I pointed the light out but saw nothing. Just the shed standing there. I watched for a minute and then went back to bed. I couldn't sleep for a while. Next morning, I walked around the cabin to check for tracks or animals. I saw nothing, but I noticed the shed door was open just a little. The lock was still there, hanging on the latch, but the door had a small gap now. I stared at it for a long time. I knew it was shut yesterday. I reached out and tried to push the door open, but it wouldn't go further than an inch. Something inside was blocking it. I tried to peek through the gap, but it was too dark. I tapped the door. Nothing. I put the lock back in place and walked away. That whole day, I felt off, like I was being watched. I couldn't explain it. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt like something was waiting. Every time I stepped outside, I looked toward the trees, expecting something to move. That night, I stayed inside. I locked the door, closed the curtains, and kept my flashlight close. I turned off the lights and lay in bed, staring at the shadows on the ceiling. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I heard footsteps. Not animal sounds, actual steps, crunching on the gravel around the cabin. Slow, steady. I sat up, heart racing. I didn't move. I just listened. The steps moved toward the back of the cabin. Then silence. Then something metal scraped lightly. I crept to the back window, pulled the curtain just a crack, and looked out. The shed door was wide open. I froze. I stayed there, watching. My flashlight was in my hand, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to be seen. Nothing moved. I waited a long time. No more sounds. I finally backed away from the window, locked my bedroom door, and sat on the bed with my back to the wall. I didn't sleep. At sunrise, I went outside. The shed was open. The lock was lying on the ground, bent. I stepped closer. The door was halfway open now. I pushed it slowly, creaked. Inside, it was dark and smelled like mold, dust in the air, broken shelves, rusty tools, a shovel, a tarp on the ground, some rope, and an old sleeping bag. The sleeping bag looked used. Like recently, there were footprints in the dust. Small ones, barefoot. I stepped back out. I felt sick. I walked around the cabin, checking everything. Nothing else looked touched. I tried calling someone, but there was still no signal. I thought about leaving right then, but part of me told myself I was overreacting. Maybe a hiker found the place and used the shed to sleep. Maybe it was just a drifter. I didn't want to panic. I spent the day inside. Every little sound made me jump. I kept the knife near me. I cooked some food but barely ate. I didn't read. I didn't do anything. I just waited for night to come again. And when it did, the footsteps came back. This time they circled the cabin. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Slow steps, around and around. I sat in the dark, holding the knife. I didn't move. The steps stopped at the front door. Then silence. Then I heard a soft knock. Just 2 light taps. Then nothing. I stayed like that the whole night. Eyes wide, ears sharp, barely breathing. In the morning, I went outside. No one there. The shed was empty now. The sleeping bag was gone. The tarp too. Just the broken shelves and dust. I looked around for tracks. I saw faint prints leading toward the woods. I packed my things fast. I was done. I wasn't going to stay another night. I loaded my stuff in the car and was about to leave when I noticed something behind the cabin. On the back wall, someone had carved something into the wood. It said, "I watched you sleep." That was it. I drove off without looking back. I didn't stop until I was back on the highway, surrounded by cars and noise. I didn't tell anyone for a while. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Who was it? How long had they been there? Was it someone hiding in the shed the whole time? Why didn't they break in? Were they just messing with me? A few weeks later, I emailed the cabin owner. I didn't explain everything. I just said someone had been living in the shed and they should check it out. They never replied. I looked up the listing again and it was gone. Sometimes late at night when I'm in bed, I think about those footsteps. The slow, quiet steps. The knock on the door. The words carved in the wood. And I wonder how many times I almost opened that door. And if I had, what would have been waiting on the other side? I booked the cabin because I thought I needed space. For months, my life had felt loud. Traffic, notifications, work emails, people. All I wanted was to go somewhere quiet, just for a week. No phone, no laptop, no internet. Just me and silence. The place I picked was about a 6-hour drive from the city. It sat deep in a wooded area in northern Idaho, not too far from a lake, with no neighbors for miles. I found it on a rental website, listed by an old couple who lived in town. They'd built the cabin decades ago, used it when they were younger, and now rented it out during the summers. I liked that it looked plain. No fancy upgrades, no hot tubs, just a small wooden house with 1 bedroom, a living room, and a kitchen. There was a generator out back for power and a pump for water. Everything ran on propane or firewood. It was exactly what I thought I wanted. I arrived late in the afternoon. The last 30 minutes of the drive were on a narrow dirt road that twisted up through the trees, all dust and rocks and dips. When I got out of my car, I noticed the quiet right away. Not silence exactly, but natural quiet. Just the wind in the trees and a few birds. I couldn't hear cars or people or phones. I stood there for a long minute and took it in. The cabin was smaller than it looked in pictures, but not in a bad way. It felt tight and tucked into the woods like it had been there forever. The windows were old, the door creaked, and the floor had a slight tilt in one corner. There were no curtains, just open glass panes that let in light and trees and sky. I unpacked what little I brought. A cooler full of food, a backpack with books and clothes, a first aid kit, and a pistol I kept in my glove box. I had no real reason to bring the gun. I didn't even like guns, but I figured I'd be deep in the woods, and it might help me sleep better. That first night was good. I lit a fire in the old iron stove and warmed a pot of soup. I read until it got too dark to see, then sat in the wooden chair by the window and stared out at the trees. I slept early, wrapped in 2 heavy blankets, and woke only once to a strange sound outside. Maybe a branch falling or a deer in the brush, but I fell back asleep right after. By the 3rd day, the peace started to shift. It was subtle, like when a room gets colder but you can't feel wind. I started to notice little things. It began with a footprint. I was out by the back of the cabin, tossing chopped wood into the bin, when I noticed a deep mark in the dirt about 10 feet from the tree line. It wasn't mine. I'd been wearing hiking boots with thick soles. This one looked like a flat-bottomed shoe, like a sneaker or maybe a slip-on. No tread, just smooth rubber pressed down into the soil. The size looked average, maybe a men's size 9 or 10. I stared at it for a long time and tried to remember if maybe I'd stepped there when I first arrived. But it didn't make sense. The dirt was too loose. Any print from 3 days ago would have been blown away or filled in. This one looked fresh. I felt stupid, but I walked a circle around the cabin, looked for other prints, found one more on the opposite side, near the generator. That one was fainter, like someone had stepped there lightly or maybe was on their toes. Again, the same smooth bottom, same shape. I didn't like it. It made me feel watched, like I wasn't alone. I checked the doors and windows. Nothing was broken. Everything was still locked. The gun was still in the drawer where I left it. I tried to shake it off. Maybe the prints had been there all along. Maybe I hadn't noticed. But I started locking the door during the day too. That night, it took me a long time to fall asleep. I kept thinking about the prints. My mind started running through all the stupid stories I'd heard about people hiding in cabins, or stalking hikers, or squatting in the woods. I knew most of it was just internet garbage, but it still made my stomach tight. I pushed the table in front of the door before I went to bed, just in case. At some point during the night, I woke up. It was still dark, real dark, with no moon, no lights. I wasn't sure what woke me at first. Then I realized I was hearing something outside. It was soft, a slow scraping noise, not fast or sharp, just a long, dragging sound like someone pulling something heavy across the ground. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just lay there under the blanket and listened. The sound kept going, maybe 10 or 15 seconds, then stopped. Silence again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I went outside and looked around. I didn't see anything out of place. No new footprints. No marks in the dirt. But I walked out to the edge of the trees and noticed something strange near the base of a pine. A long, faint groove in the dirt, about 3 inches wide, maybe 2 feet long. It looked like something had been dragged. I followed it for a few feet, but it faded quickly. There were broken pine needles and disturbed leaves, but not much else. I went back inside, locked the door, and pulled the gun from the drawer. I loaded it this time. Then I took it with me everywhere I went, even just to use the outhouse. I thought about leaving. I should have left, but I kept telling myself I was just being paranoid, that I was overreacting. I told myself I'd stay one more night. If anything else felt wrong, I'd go. That day was quiet, but I couldn't relax. I kept looking out the window every few minutes. I sat with my back to the wall so I could watch the door. I stopped reading. I didn't eat much. The sun felt like it was taking forever to go down. When it finally did, I locked up everything and pushed both the table and the chair in front of the door. Then I sat there, fully dressed, holding the gun. Sometime around midnight, I heard the footsteps. They were light, careful, someone walking on the porch. I knew it wasn't an animal. The steps were too steady, too human. I didn't move. I sat there in the dark and held my breath. The steps stopped. I waited. Then I heard the faint sound of the door handle moving, slow, like someone testing it. Then a second time, a little harder, then silence. I raised the gun and pointed it at the door, but nothing happened. No banging, no breaking, no voice, just silence again. I sat there for hours, didn't sleep, didn't blink, just watched. When the sun came up, I packed everything as fast as I could, threw it in the car, and didn't even lock the cabin behind me. I drove fast down the dirt road, kept checking the rearview mirror, didn't stop until I hit pavement. I got back to town by noon. I went straight to a gas station and sat there in the lot for an hour, just breathing. When I finally checked my phone, I had dozens of missed notifications. I didn't answer any of them. I just sat and stared out the windshield. Later that night, after I checked into a cheap motel, I called the number for the couple who owned the cabin. I didn't tell them everything, just that someone had been outside at night, that I didn't feel safe, that they might want to check it out. The woman on the phone sounded surprised. She said they hadn't rented it to anyone else in months, said they hadn't been up there themselves all season, said the place was too remote for most people. That was the last time I talked to them. I didn't file a report. I didn't call the police. What was I going to say? That I saw footprints? Heard sounds? I didn't see a face. Didn't have proof. And honestly, I didn't want to think about it anymore. But I never went back to the woods after that. Not for camping, not for hiking, not even to drive through. I started sleeping with a light on, started checking every lock twice. Months passed, then a year, and one day I got a package in the mail. No return address, just my name neatly typed. Inside was a single photo. It was me sitting in the cabin on that third day, reading by the window, taken from outside, from the tree line. I burned it, and I moved. It was the end of October when I drove up to the cabin. The cold had just started settling in the way it does up in the hills, slowly but sharply. I had taken 2 weeks off work. No real reason, just burned out, I guess. I wanted silence. No traffic sounds, no screens, no neighbors playing music through the wall. I wanted to sit in the middle of nowhere and feel the quiet pull the tension out of my muscles. The cabin wasn't mine, but it felt like it. It belonged to my uncle, but he'd left the country a few years ago, and I was the only one in the family who still used it. It was about 3.5 hours away from the city. You had to take this old gravel road for nearly an hour off the main highway. No cell signal, no Wi-Fi, just trees, dirt, animals, and a rusted-out mailbox that leaned sideways like it had been punched by time itself. The cabin had 2 rooms. One was a small living space with a fireplace, couch, and a little table. The other was the bedroom. I had stocked the place with canned food, bottled water, a small propane stove, and a bunch of firewood I'd stacked earlier in the year. There was an outhouse 20 feet behind the cabin, which was fine by me. I didn't mind roughing it. The first 2 days were exactly what I wanted. I woke up early, made instant coffee, went outside with a blanket wrapped around me, and watched the trees sway. The wind never really stopped out there. It just softened and strengthened like it was breathing. Sometimes I heard distant cracking, branches falling, or maybe deer moving through the woods. At night, I lit a fire in the old brick fireplace and listened to it pop and hiss while I read some old paperbacks I found in a box under the couch. I didn't think about work. I didn't think about anything. On the third night, something changed. I had finished a can of chili and was cleaning the little pot outside in the dark, wearing a headlamp. The light picked up fog in the air, even though it hadn't rained. There was a strange heaviness to the air, like everything was holding its breath. I heard a branch snap. It was close, maybe 20 or 30 feet to my left, behind the line of thick pines. I turned my headlamp toward it, expecting to catch a raccoon or a deer's eyes reflecting back. Nothing, just trees. I stood there a minute longer, pot in one hand, spoon in the other, heart beating a little faster for no good reason. The rest of the night was quiet, but I couldn't relax. I kept looking out the window every 10 minutes, convinced I'd seen something move past it even though it was probably just my reflection. I left the lamp on all night. The next morning, I told myself I was being stupid. I went for a walk along the narrow path that ran past the back of the cabin and followed it all the way to a dried-up creek bed. I stayed out for hours, collecting wood and stacking some rocks for a little fire ring I was planning to build. When I got back to the cabin around 4 in the afternoon, I noticed something that made me stop walking. There were boot prints by the front steps. Not mine. These were bigger and deeper. I always approached the cabin from the side, and I hadn't been down to the front since the first day. The prints came from the woods and stopped right at the door, then turned back the way they came. I just stood there staring at them, trying to think of an explanation. Maybe a hunter? Maybe someone just passing through? I checked the door. Locked, same as I'd left it. Nothing missing, but it rattled me more than I expected. I didn't like the idea that someone had come that close and just stood there. That night, I sat inside with a knife in my lap. I hadn't brought a gun, just figured I wouldn't need one. But the knife felt small and useless now. I kept listening. Every sound outside felt sharp and deliberate. A squirrel scratching bark sounded like footsteps. Wind gusts brushing the trees sounded like someone whispering out of earshot. I barely slept. The next day, I checked the area around the cabin. I followed the tracks into the trees for about 50 yards until I lost them in a patch of pine needles. The forest felt off. I know how that sounds, but I've spent a lot of time in woods, and this was different. Felt like the trees were watching. I never felt alone, even though I couldn't see anything. I stayed near the cabin after that, kept the fire going even during the day. I didn't want the smoke to stop. I figured if someone was out there, they'd know I was still here, and maybe that would be enough to keep them away. But it wasn't. 2 nights later, I heard the knock. It was just one. Not loud, not soft, just solid. A knock, not a bang. Like someone was letting me know they were there but didn't want to seem rude about it. I was already awake. I'd been lying there, eyes open, staring at the shadows on the ceiling. The knock came from the front door. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I just lay there and waited. I stared at the door from the bedroom doorway, barely peeking out. The fire had gone low, and everything was dim and flickering. I waited a full hour before I got up and checked. No one was there. No footprints this time. Nothing moved outside except for the wind pushing against the dead leaves. I didn't sleep that night either. I should have left the next morning, but I didn't. I told myself it was probably some stupid prank. Maybe a camper trying to be funny. Maybe a local messing with me. I didn't want to overreact. But the truth is, I was scared to go outside. I didn't want to walk to the truck and turn my back to the woods. I didn't want to see someone standing on the edge of the trees, watching. That day, I stayed inside. I pushed the table in front of the door. I closed the shutters. I boiled water and made sure my flashlight batteries were fresh. I charged my phone from the solar pack even though there was no signal. I kept the fire burning. That night, I waited. I sat in the chair by the door with the knife again. I didn't read. I didn't eat. I just listened. Nothing happened. Until the morning. At first light, I opened the door. There, at the bottom of the steps, was a dead rabbit. Its neck was broken, and it had been laid out neatly, legs tucked under like it had just gone to sleep. I didn't touch it. I closed the door and sat down. By noon, it was gone. No tracks, no blood, no sign that anything had been there. I left the next morning. I didn't clean up. I didn't bother folding the blankets or packing the unused food. I threw everything in the truck and left. I didn't even stop at the gas station on the way back. I drove all the way home without pausing, checking my mirrors every few minutes like someone might be following me, even though I knew that was insane. It's been months since that trip. I haven't gone back to the cabin. I don't talk about it with anyone, but I think about it every day. I think about the knock. I think about how calm it sounded, how sure of itself, not demanding, not threatening, just there, like whoever or whatever knocked wasn't looking to get in. They were just letting me know they could. And I think about the fact that I never saw them. Not once, not even a glimpse, just prints, a sound, and a rabbit that vanished. That's what gets to me most. The silence, the patience, the way it didn't try to scare me, because real threats don't make noise. They wait, and I think it's still waiting, out there, in those woods, where it knows I'll go back someday, because people always do. I I never really thought I'd spend that much time alone in the woods. I always imagined people who did stuff like that either had something to prove or were running from something. I wasn't doing either. I just needed a break from people, from noise, from screens. I was working remote for the last 2 years and felt like the world around me had become nothing but apartment walls and an endless scroll of doom. I didn't want to do anything drastic. Just get away for a bit. Somewhere quiet, somewhere natural. I found this listing online. A small private cabin in northern Montana, not far from the Canadian border. It looked simple, wooden structure, 1 bedroom, kitchen, small front porch. The photos showed tall pine trees crowding in around it, and a dirt path leading from a gravel road down to its front steps. No neighbors nearby, no internet, and barely any cell signal. Exactly what I wanted. I booked it for 3 weeks. The guy who owned it gave me basic instructions by email. There was a small generator out back for power, a gas heater, plenty of split firewood, and a gravity-fed water system from a tank uphill. He said to keep an eye on the generator fuel levels and conserve what I could. If I ran low, there were extra tanks in a shed beside the cabin. He also warned me to respect the land and keep my eyes open for bears. That's standard stuff in this part of the country, so I didn't think much of it. I drove out there in my SUV, about 9 hours on the road. The last few miles were nothing but bumpy dirt paths that curled through heavy forest. I passed a couple of small hunting shacks and old signs with faded paint, but not a single person. It felt like I'd driven straight out of time and into a place where people had just stopped coming. That was the goal, I guess. When I finally pulled up to the clearing where the cabin sat, I just stopped and looked at it for a minute. It was like a postcard. Quiet pine trees, the sun slipping low behind the ridge, soft wind stirring the dry grass around the porch. The wood of the cabin was dark with age but solid. The windows had thick shutters open on the sides. There was even a rusty metal chair on the porch that looked like it hadn't moved in years. Everything about it told me you are alone out here, and I liked that. I unpacked and settled in. Inside, the place smelled like cedar and dust. There were shelves lined with canned food and dry goods, exactly like the owner said. A small wood stove stood in the corner with a stack of logs next to it. The bedroom had a single bed with a thick old blanket. The floor creaked a little under my weight, but the place felt sturdy. The first few days were exactly what I needed. I cooked simple meals, hiked the nearby trails, read books I'd been putting off for months. I even started journaling just to put my thoughts somewhere. I didn't see another human being the entire time. The only noises were birds, wind, and the occasional distant rustle in the trees that I usually chalked up to deer or small animals. It was on the 4th night that I noticed something strange. I was chopping wood late in the afternoon to make sure I had enough for the cold night. The air was sharp, and I could see my breath even before sunset. After a while, I paused to catch my breath and looked downhill through the trees. That's when I saw it just for a second. A small structure, maybe 200 feet down the slope, partially hidden by trees. I hadn't noticed it before. It was definitely man-made. Looked like another small cabin or a shed, but darker and older than mine. That was weird because the owner never mentioned another structure nearby, and I'd already walked a good stretch of the land. I never saw anything like that. I figured maybe I missed it or maybe it was abandoned. There were a lot of old hunting lodges in these parts. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I should have seen it before. Curiosity got the better of me the next morning. I hiked down the slope toward where I thought the structure was. Took longer than I expected to find it again. The trees down there were thicker and closer together. The ground dipped unevenly, and there were a lot of old rocks and fallen logs that made the walk slow. But eventually, I spotted it again, this time clearer. It was a small wooden building about the size of a tool shed, but it didn't look like it was used for tools. There were no windows, just thick wooden boards nailed across where openings might have been. The door was heavy and had a padlock on it, rusted but solid. The whole thing looked like it had been shut for years. Still, something about it gave me a bad feeling. It wasn't just that it was locked or old. It felt like it wasn't meant to be found, like someone had gone out of their way to hide it. The trees around it were grown in tight, like they were shielding it. I didn't try to open the door. I just stood there for a while, feeling this weird pressure in my chest, like my body was telling me to leave it alone. I walked back to my cabin and tried to forget about it, but the image of it stuck in my head. That thick locked door, the strange silence around it. Even the birds seemed to avoid the area when I was standing there. I told myself it was probably just an old root cellar or maybe a hunting supply stash. Nothing to be worried about. But that night, I barely slept. I kept hearing noises outside, not just branches swaying or leaves rustling. These were sharper, snapping twigs, soft crunches like someone walking. I got up once around 2 a.m. and peered out the window, but it was too dark to see anything. I stood there for 10 minutes, holding my breath, straining to hear more. Eventually, I convinced myself it was a deer or maybe a bear nosing around for scraps. In the morning, I went outside and checked the area. I didn't see any footprints, but the frost on the grass was disturbed in a few places, as if someone had walked through. Not animal tracks, not boot prints either, just patches of compressed grass, the kind that looked like someone had been standing still in one place. I thought about packing up and heading home early, but I also didn't want to seem like I was losing my nerve. I had come out here to disconnect, to tough it out. I told myself I was just spooking myself over nothing. That old cabin down the slope was playing with my imagination. That night, I locked the doors and put a chair under the doorknob. I kept the axe next to the bed. The generator ran out of fuel the next evening. I went out back to grab another canister from the shed, just like the owner said. But when I opened the shed door, the fuel cans were gone. All of them. There were 5 when I arrived. Now there were none. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where they should have been. There weren't any signs of forced entry. The lock was still in place. I knew I didn't use that much fuel. I was being careful, only running the generator for a few hours each night. The cans didn't vanish. Someone had taken them. I didn't sleep that night at all. I kept the lights off, sat by the window with the axe in my lap, staring into the dark woods. Every few hours, I'd hear a thud or a crack outside. Sometimes it was close, other times it was far off, like whoever or whatever was out there was circling. At sunrise, I made a decision. I was going to hike back up the road toward where I parked the SUV. It was about a 2-mile hike, but I needed to know the car was still there. I packed my essentials into a backpack, knife, flashlight, food, first aid kit, and set out quickly. I didn't look back at the cabin. When I reached the place where I'd left the SUV, my heart dropped. It was gone. No broken glass, no tire tracks, just empty dirt where the car used to sit. I ran around in circles, checking nearby spots, thinking maybe I misremembered where I left it. But I hadn't. I knew exactly where it was. It was gone. I sat down on the cold ground and felt this heavy dread sink into my bones. I had no car, no fuel, no phone signal, and no one knew exactly where I was. I hadn't given anyone the full coordinates, just the general area. That afternoon, I heard movement outside the cabin again. This time it was different. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling the structure. I didn't move. I crouched near the window, watching. A figure passed between the trees. Just a shadow, tall, thin, slow. I couldn't make out the face. Stopped once, just at the edge of the clearing, as if looking straight at me. Then it turned and slipped back into the woods. I stayed inside for 2 more days, eating as little as possible, trying to conserve everything. No power, no light at night, just me in the dark, listening to footsteps I couldn't place. On the 3rd night, the front door handle rattled. Slowly, like someone testing it. Then nothing. I sat in the corner with my heart pounding, clutching the axe like a lifeline. Hours passed in silence after that. At dawn, I made a decision. I was going to break the lock on the old structure down the hill. I needed shelter that wasn't being watched, or I needed answers. Either way, I couldn't sit in the cabin like a trapped animal anymore. I hiked down with my axe and a crowbar I found under the sink. When I got to the old building, I didn't hesitate. I smashed at the lock until it cracked. Then I pulled the door open. The smell hit me first. Old, rotting wood and something else, something sour and foul. Inside, the air was thick and stale. The walls were lined with hooks and shelves. On one of the shelves were tools. Not regular tools, pliers, rusted blades, chains. There were dark stains on the floor. I don't like to talk much about what happened that week in the woods, but sometimes I feel like I need to. I don't tell anyone in person. I don't think I could look them in the eyes while saying it, but maybe writing it down will help. Maybe if I explain everything from the start, the way it really happened, it'll be easier to move on. It started on a Monday morning in late September. I had taken a week off from work because I felt like I was starting to lose control of everything. I was always stressed, always tense, and I hadn't had more than 2 days off in almost a year. I had headaches every week. I barely slept. The noise and movement of the city made it worse. I wanted a break from screens, people, cars, deadlines, and everything else that came with living a normal life. So I decided to go alone to a cabin up north, away from the city. I'd booked a small place near a quiet lake about 3 hours from where I lived. I found it on a small website that listed old family-owned cabins. It looked basic and simple in the pictures. Just a single-story wooden cabin, with a small dock, a boat, and thick woods surrounding it from every side. No internet, no cell service, just trees, water, and quiet. That's all I wanted. The owner gave me instructions by email. The cabin was unlocked. The key was in the drawer near the door. I was supposed to bring my own food and supplies. There was a well pump for water. No electricity, just some solar lamps, a gas stove, and a generator I could run if needed. I packed my car on Sunday night with everything I thought I'd need. Cans of soup, rice, a small cooler with eggs and vegetables, a few pots and pans, a flashlight, extra clothes, a first aid kit, and my sleeping bag. I also brought a fishing rod because the owner said the lake was full of trout. The drive was peaceful. The highway gave way to smaller roads. Then the smaller roads turned into gravel and dirt paths. By the time I reached the turnoff, it was just a narrow trail through the trees. There were signs nailed to trees pointing toward different cabins. Mine was marked with a small wooden sign that just said, Windmere. I followed the path down a long hill, bouncing a bit as the tires rolled over rocks and dips. When I finally saw the lake through the trees, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The water was still. The sky was pale gray. Trees in orange and red surrounded the water like a bowl. It was quiet, so quiet I could hear the wind moving through the branches above me. The cabin looked just like the pictures, weathered but sturdy. One window on each side, a metal chimney sticking out of the roof, a small wooden porch with a bench and a log pile. There were pine needles everywhere, even on the roof. It didn't look like anyone had stayed there for a while. I parked beside the cabin and got out. The air smelled like wet leaves and old wood. I went inside and found the key in the drawer just like the owner said. The inside was basic, wood walls, a table, 2 chairs, a stove, a counter, and a small bedroom with a single bed. I dropped my bags, set up my sleeping bag on top of the bed, and started unpacking. That first day, I didn't do much. I walked to the edge of the lake and looked around. Across the water, maybe 300 or 400 feet away, I saw another cabin. That one wasn't listed on the website, but it wasn't unusual. Sometimes there are private cabins around these lakes. That one looked smaller than mine. No dock. The windows looked dark. No smoke from the chimney. I assumed it was empty. I ate a can of soup that night and read a book by the light of a small solar lamp. I went to sleep early. It was quiet. No cars. No sirens. Just the sound of frogs and the occasional splash of water. I felt good, relaxed for the first time in a while. The next day, I went fishing. I rowed out into the lake in the small metal boat tied to the dock. The water was calm. I caught 2 trout and kept one. I cooked it with some onions and ate it with rice. That afternoon, I went for a long walk in the woods, staying close to the edge of the lake so I wouldn't get lost. I didn't see any people, just squirrels, birds, and 1 deer. Still no signs of movement from the cabin across the lake. No lights, no smoke, no boats. It was probably empty for the season. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. because I heard something. It was like a splash in the water. First, I thought it was just an animal, but then I heard a soft thump, like something hitting wood. I sat up and listened. It was coming from the dock. I didn't want to open the door right away. I just sat there, holding my breath. The sound stopped after a minute. I waited. Nothing else happened. I told myself it was probably a beaver or a fish. The next morning, I went out to the dock. There were wet footprints on the wood. Human footprints. Bare feet. Not shoe prints. Just a set of wet prints walking down the dock and back again. They were faint and drying already. I looked around, checked the shoreline, the trees, but I didn't see anyone. I stood there for a long time just watching the lake. Then I looked across the water at the other cabin. One of the windows looked open. I couldn't remember if it was open before. That day, I didn't leave the cabin much. I stayed close. I kept the door locked. I watched the water, the trees, and that cabin across the lake. The window that was open before was now closed. I didn't see anyone. No boats, no movement, no lights, nothing. But something felt wrong now. The silence didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt heavy. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept hearing noises, twigs snapping, water splashing. Around midnight, I thought I heard footsteps outside the window. I didn't look. I stayed still in my sleeping bag and waited. I had my flashlight in my hand the whole night. At some point, I fell asleep from exhaustion. When I woke up, there was mud on the porch, smudges on the doorknob. I didn't leave those. I decided to hike back up to the road and see if I could get a signal on my phone. It was about a mile uphill. When I got to the top, I checked. No service. I thought about leaving altogether, but I told myself it was probably just someone passing by, maybe a hunter or a drifter. It wasn't uncommon in remote areas, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I walked back down slowly, listening the whole way. Every branch crack made me stop and turn. When I got back, everything looked the same, but then I noticed something. The fishing rod I left beside the door was gone. Just gone. That evening, I kept the door locked. I pulled the table in front of it. I turned off the lamp early and just sat in the dark, watching the window. The moonlight was bright enough to see the lake. I saw movement across the water. A light, just for a second, in the window of the other cabin. Then darkness again. At some point, I must have dozed off. I woke up to the sound of the doorknob moving. Softly, slowly. Someone was trying to turn it. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then it stopped. I waited in the dark for hours. No more sounds. The next morning, I found boot prints in the dirt behind the cabin. Not bare feet this time. Boots. They led toward the woods and vanished. I packed my bag. I was ready to leave. I hiked back up to the road. Still no cell service. I got to my car. The tires were slashed. All four. Deep cuts. I stood there for a long time, not knowing what to do. I walked back to the cabin slowly, carrying only the essentials. I left most of the food behind in the cooler. I felt sick. Someone had been watching me, coming at night, messing with me. They knew I was alone. They knew I didn't have a phone. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat with my back against the wall, holding the flashlight in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other. I kept the lights off. I stared at the windows. Around 3 a.m., I saw a shadow pass outside. Just a shape. Slow. Careful. Then it was gone. In the morning, I found the boat gone. It wasn't tied to the dock anymore. The rope was cut. Cleanly. I walked along the edge of the lake for a while, looking for it. I didn't find it, but I saw something else. A piece of my fishing rod, snapped in half, sticking out of the mud near the shore on the opposite side, right below the other cabin. I didn't go closer. That day was long. I didn't eat much. I sat inside with the knife in my lap and listened. In the afternoon, I saw movement across the lake again. Person, just for a second, standing in front of that cabin, staring. Then they stepped back inside. I stayed inside all night, just waiting. Around midnight, I heard something on the roof, like feet, slow, careful steps. I turned off the lamp and stayed in the corner. The steps moved across the roof, then stopped. Then silence. I didn't sleep. I didn't move. In the morning, I checked the roof with a chair. There were scuff marks on the metal chimney, like someone had climbed it. I was done. I packed everything. I carried my backpack and started walking. I didn't care how far I had to go. I just needed to find a phone, a ranger, a road, anything. I had never really been the kind of guy who needed to get away from everything. People said it all the time, how they needed to escape the noise, the people, the phones, the constant rush. That was never something I thought about. My life was simple. I worked in IT. I sat in front of a screen, typing, clicking, fixing things for people who barely knew how to turn a computer off the right way. I didn't mind it, really. The money was steady. I had a small apartment in the city. Nothing special. A one-bedroom with creaky floors, second-hand furniture, and a window that rattled when it was windy. But it was mine. I liked it. So when my friend Raj told me I could use his family's old cabin for a weekend, I didn't jump at the idea. I actually told him no, twice. It wasn't until he really pushed it, said he was going to be out of the country for 2 weeks and that the place would be empty anyway, that I started thinking maybe a weekend out of town wouldn't kill me. He sent me the location. The place was in the woods, about 4 hours north of where I lived. Remote, but not completely isolated. He told me there were other cabins around, some of them seasonal, some owned by people who lived up there year-round. No cell service, but the cabin had electricity and running water. No Wi-Fi. I remember that detail hitting me harder than it should have. No internet meant no emails, no work, no YouTube, no news. Just me, trees, and silence. I left on a Friday afternoon. I packed light, some clothes, my laptop, even though I figured it would be useless. A couple books I never had time to read, and a cooler with food and water. I didn't own a gun or anything like that, but I brought a pocket knife. Not because I thought I'd need it, just because it felt like something you brought when you went into the woods. The drive was long. First, it was highways and exits. Then it turned into 2-lane roads. Then gravel. Then nothing but forest on both sides. The sun started going down just as I reached the road that led to the cabin. It wasn't really a road, more like a wide dirt path, overgrown in some places and lined with tire tracks in others. There was a rusty gate at the front, unlocked. I drove through slowly, branches scraping against the sides of my car. The cabin appeared after another 10 minutes of crawling through the woods. It sat in a small clearing, hidden by tall trees that seemed to fold in around it. The building was old but sturdy. Dark wood siding, green moss creeping up the base, a slanted roof, and a small front porch with 2 rocking chairs. There were no lights on and everything looked still. I parked beside it and got out. The air smelled like wet leaves and pine. The ground was soft under my feet. No traffic, no voices, no sirens, just wind, trees, and birds. I stood there for a minute and just listened. I could see why people liked this. It was peaceful. Inside, the cabin was cleaner than I expected. The furniture was old, but it had that cozy, rustic look people pay good money for. Wooden floors, a stone fireplace, a small kitchen with a gas stove, and a narrow hallway that led to a bedroom and a bathroom. Everything was quiet. I unpacked, put my food in the fridge, and walked through the cabin, flipping on lights. They flickered for a second but stayed on. I spent the first night just relaxing. I made pasta on the stove, read a few chapters of a book, and sat outside on the porch for a while, staring at the stars. It was darker than anything I'd ever seen. The kind of dark that made you feel like you weren't even on the same planet anymore. I heard owls in the wind, and once or twice what sounded like footsteps in the trees. But I figured it was animals. Deer maybe, or raccoons. I went back inside, locked the door, and went to bed. The first weird thing happened the next morning. I woke up early, around 6 a.m. Not because of a noise or anything, just naturally. The room was cold, and I could see the sun coming in through the window. I made coffee, stood by the porch railing, and looked out at the trees. That's when I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the dirt. Not animal prints, real footprints. Human, big ones, barefoot. They led from the edge of the woods to the side of the cabin, then disappeared behind it. The ground was soft, so the prints were deep. I stared at them for a while, trying to figure out if they'd been there before. But I'd parked near that spot when I arrived, and I was pretty sure I would have seen them then. These looked fresh, like someone had walked through while I was sleeping. I walked around the cabin, following the tracks. They went around the back, stopped near the bathroom window, and then turned back toward the woods. Same bare feet, same deep impressions. No shoes, no tire tracks, no sign of anyone else. Just those footprints. I stood there for a long time just looking at the trees. My heart wasn't racing yet. Not really, but I remember feeling strange, like I was being watched. I told myself it was probably a hiker. Maybe someone got lost and came up to the cabin to look for help. Maybe they thought no one was here. Maybe they were drunk, or high, or mentally ill. None of those ideas made me feel better. I stayed close to the cabin for the rest of the day. I didn't go for a walk. I didn't read much. I just stayed alert. Every time I heard a twig snap, I looked up. Every time a squirrel ran across the roof, my muscles tensed. I locked the doors, checked the windows, and kept the pocket knife in my back pocket, just in case. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept the lights on. I kept waking up, checking the windows, listening for footsteps. At some point, probably around 3 a.m., I heard something outside. It wasn't loud, just the sound of twigs snapping. Then something brushing against the side of the cabin. I froze in bed, heart pounding, breathing shallow. I waited, listening. After a minute, it stopped. In the morning, I checked again. No new footprints, nothing stolen, nothing broken, but I found a small pile of rocks on the porch railing. 5 of them, all the same size, stacked neatly. I hadn't put them there. That's when I really started to worry. I didn't know if someone was messing with me or if there was a person out there who didn't want me here. Either way, it felt like I wasn't alone, like I was being watched, followed, stalked. I spent the day inside, peeking out the windows. I saw movement in the trees a few times. Could have been branches swaying. Could have been something else. I didn't go outside. I thought about leaving, but it was late, and I didn't want to drive those dirt roads in the dark. I told myself I'd leave in the morning. That night was the worst. Started just after midnight. I was lying in bed, lights off, trying to fall asleep. I heard something creak outside. Then the porch steps. 1, 2, 3. Each one heavier than the last. Then silence. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just listened. After a few minutes, I heard the doorknob move. Just a soft metallic clink. Then pressure, like someone was leaning against the door, testing it. It held. It was locked. Then came the whispering sound. Not voices, more like breathing. Long, slow breaths, right against the door. And then nothing. I stayed like that for hours. I didn't sleep. I didn't move. I waited until sunlight started coming through the window. Then I got up, grabbed my keys, and packed everything in 5 minutes. I didn't eat. I didn't shower. I didn't look back. When I walked out onto the porch, there was something waiting for me. Another pile of rocks. This time, it wasn't 5. It was 7. A rusty old key had been placed on top of the stack. I didn't touch it. I got in the car, locked the doors, and started driving. I didn't stop until I hit the main road 2 hours later. My hands were shaking. My jaw was tight. My shirt was soaked with sweat. When I got back home, I told Raj what happened. He didn't laugh. He didn't say it was probably nothing. He just said his uncle used to talk about a man who lived out there, deep in the woods, alone. No one knew his name. They called him the Quiet Man. He'd been around for decades, supposedly harmless, supposedly just a recluse. I didn't care. I wasn't going back. It's been almost a year now. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still see those footprints. Still hear the creak of the porch steps. Still feel the air go cold when I remember the breathing at the door. I still don't know what that key was for, or why the piles of rocks kept growing, or how someone could move around so quietly, so carefully, in the dark woods around that cabin. But I know this: someone was out there, and they didn't want me there, and they never said a word. They just watched, waited, listened, and they're probably still there, right now, behind the trees. I don't know what I was really trying to run from when I booked the cabin. I wasn't being chased by anything, not in the literal sense. Life had just become loud. I was tired of the constant noise of the city, the people, the horns, the digital world where you couldn't go a minute without someone needing something. Work was nonstop, phones ringing, emails. I hadn't taken a real break in years. So when I found the listing for this old cabin deep in the northern woods, off-grid, completely private, surrounded by trees and nothing else, I booked it without thinking twice. I packed up the basics. Enough food for 2 weeks, water containers, a solar power bank, my camping gear even though the cabin had a bed, flashlights, a folding shovel, a knife just in case. I didn't tell many people where I was going, just left a basic message with my brother and said I'd be out of reach for a while. He probably thought I just needed a mental reset. He wasn't wrong. The drive out was long, 6 hours on paved roads, then another hour on a gravel path through dense woods. The last stretch wasn't even marked. I had to follow GPS coordinates and watch the trees slowly swallow my car. The cabin appeared like a shadow between the trees. It was old, dark brown wood, moss along the roofline, one tiny porch, no signs of modern life. It looked untouched for years, even though the listing claimed it was cleaned and maintained regularly. I didn't mind. That was part of the appeal. I parked about 20 feet from the cabin, just in a small clearing where the trees gave enough space for my car to rest without branches scraping the paint. It was silent. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my boots crunching dried pine needles and gravel as I got my gear out and walked toward the front door. Inside was simple. One small living room with an old couch, a wood stove, and a low table. A kitchenette that ran along the wall with a rusted sink and some dusty cupboards. A small bathroom with a compost toilet and a rust-stained sink. No shower. The bedroom was just a frame with a mattress, clean enough, with one window that looked out to the trees. I liked it right away. Felt raw, like I could finally breathe. The first few days were calm. I'd wake up early, make oatmeal or eggs, then sit outside with coffee and watch the trees move. No signal, no people. I'd walk around, maybe a mile or 2 in each direction, exploring the woods, noting fallen logs, listening for animals. I saw a deer on the second day, just standing about 30 feet away, staring at me like it didn't know what to make of me. It darted off after a few seconds. I saw squirrels, heard owls at night, and saw something that looked like a coyote once, but it was too far to be sure. The peace started to fade around the 4th day. It wasn't anything loud or sudden. It was something I felt more than heard or saw. The trees around the cabin started to feel thicker, like they were leaning in just slightly. I didn't remember them being that close when I arrived. I double-checked the photos I had taken with my phone. They hadn't moved. It was just in my head. Probably. I spent that whole day walking farther than usual. I went north, using a compass and marking small trees with a bright orange string so I wouldn't get turned around. About 3 miles in, I found a half-collapsed shed. The wood was black with rot. The roof was caved in. I poked around with a stick but didn't find much. Just a broken shovel, some rusted nails, and what looked like animal bones. I didn't stay long. The place smelled like old water and mildew. Something about it made me leave faster than I expected. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind picked up for the first time since I got there, making a low howling sound around the edges of the cabin. The window in the bedroom creaked as the frame shifted slightly. I kept thinking about that shed. Who built it? Why was it left to rot? I wondered if anyone else had ever stayed in this cabin. The listing didn't say. The guest book by the stove was empty except for one name, but the writing was faded and unreadable. On the 6th day, I found the patch of disturbed soil. It was behind the cabin, about 30 feet into the trees. I was just wandering after breakfast, not really looking for anything. That part of the woods had more pine trees and soft moss on the ground. I noticed one small area where the moss was missing, and the dirt looked darker, fresher, like it had been turned recently. I knelt down and touched it. It wasn't muddy, but it was softer than the rest. Something had been buried here, or unburied. I don't know why I used the folding shovel. Maybe part of me wanted a distraction. I started digging slowly, A few inches down, the dirt became more compact, and I hit a solid object. I thought it was a rock at first, but when I cleared around it, I saw it was a wooden box, about 2 feet long, maybe 8 inches deep. Handmade, no markings. I lifted it out and carried it to the porch. I didn't want to open it inside. The lid wasn't nailed shut, just fitted tightly. When I pried it open with my knife, I found what looked like personal items. A rusted pocket knife, a rotting leather wallet with no money or ID, a small photo water-damaged and curled. I could barely make out the image. 2 people standing near a tree, one taller, one smaller. Both looked like men. Their faces were smudged and hard to see. At the bottom of the box was something wrapped in cloth. I unrolled it slowly and found what looked like an old blood-stained t-shirt. The blood had gone brown with age. There was a hole near the stomach, a hole that looked like it came from a blade. I put everything back in the box and closed it. I felt sick, not scared, just heavy, like I'd uncovered something that wasn't supposed to be found. I sat there for a while, looking out at the woods. I started thinking about the shed again, the old bones, the missing people no one probably asked about. That night, I had the worst sleep yet. I kept hearing sounds outside. Not footsteps, not voices, just soft movements. Leaves shifting, a thud against the side of the cabin. I got up once and looked out the front window. I didn't see anything, but I thought I saw the shape of something tall between the trees. I didn't go out to check. I locked the door and stayed by the window until it got light. The next day, I took the box back to where I found it and buried it again. I didn't want it near me. I packed my things. I was supposed to stay another week, but something had changed. I didn't feel alone anymore, not in a paranoid way, just a quiet sense that the forest had been watching me the whole time and was only now deciding to let me know. As I packed the car, I noticed something else. The shovel I had used was missing. I had leaned it against the cabin wall after reburying the box. It was gone. I walked around the area, checked the porch, checked behind the trees. Nothing. I gave up and got in the car. When I looked in the rearview mirror as I pulled away, I thought I saw the glint of metal deep in the trees, like the sun had caught the edge of something. I didn't stop to check. The drive out was long and quiet. I felt like I was being followed, even though I knew that was impossible. I kept checking the mirrors. I made it home by nightfall and took the longest shower I've ever had. I didn't tell my brother anything. What would I say? That I found a box with bloody clothes and a photo in the woods? I didn't report it. I know I should have, but I didn't want to get pulled into something deeper. There was no name, no ID, no body, just a box and a bad feeling. 3 weeks later, I got a letter in the mail. No return address. Inside was a printed photo, the same one I found in the box, but this time the faces were clear. 2 men standing by a tree. One of them was me. I hadn't taken that photo. I'm not sure what part of me thought it would be a good idea. Maybe it was the stress I had built up over the past year. Work had been a mess. Too many hours, too many expectations, and barely any time to breathe. Life felt like a constant race, and I just wanted silence. Real silence. Not the kind where your phone is off but your brain keeps going. I wanted the kind where even my thoughts would slow down. So I decided to get away for a week. No family, no coworkers, just me. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going, just that I was heading to a remote cabin up north near Crag Lake. It was a small place I found through an old camping forum, not a fancy Airbnb. It wasn't listed on any regular travel site. Just a man who offered his family's old cabin to people looking to disconnect. He emailed me a map. It looked simple enough. Drive 5 hours north, turn off the main road, go about 20 miles on a dirt trail, then park and hike 2 miles to the cabin. That was it. No Wi-Fi, no electricity, no running water other than what came from the lake. But it had a roof, a wood stove, and an outhouse. That was enough for me. I packed everything I thought I'd need. Canned food, a propane stove, a water filter, extra clothes, bear spray, a flashlight, a knife, and even a satellite phone, just in case. The drive up was peaceful. As the miles passed, towns got smaller, cell service dropped to nothing, and traffic became non-existent. I finally reached the dirt trail just as the sun began to dip. I followed it slowly, trying not to bottom out my car on the rough patches. The trees were dense, and the deeper I went, the quieter it got. Eventually, I parked in the clearing marked on the map and loaded my backpack. I locked the car and took one last glance at the trail before heading into the woods. The hike wasn't hard, but it was long enough to make me sweat. The trail was overgrown in places, and I kept swatting away flies and mosquitoes. It felt wild, untouched. After nearly an hour, I saw the roof of the cabin through the trees. It was smaller than I imagined, almost swallowed by the forest around it. The lake was behind it, maybe 100 feet away, calm and still. I walked around the cabin before going in. It was made of old logs, weathered and dark. The door creaked when I opened it. Inside, it smelled like dust and pine. There was a small bed against one wall, a table with 2 chairs, a wood stove, and some shelves with pots, pans, and basic supplies. A few candles sat in glass jars, and a big jug for filtering lake water sat near the door. Everything was simple. No noise, no distractions. Exactly what I wanted. The first night, I sat by the lake until it got too cold, then went inside, lit a candle, and read a book until I got sleepy. I slept surprisingly well. No buzzing from my phone, no hum of electronics, just the wind in the trees and the occasional call of a loon out on the lake. I felt good. The second day was just as peaceful. I boiled water, made instant coffee, and sat on the steps of the cabin drinking it. I didn't do much, just explored a little around the shoreline, collected some wood, and sat quietly. That evening, I cooked a simple meal, and after cleaning up, I took a quick dip in the cold lake before bed. But that night, I woke up to a noise outside, a rustling. I lay there for a moment, not moving. Could have been an animal, raccoon, deer, maybe even a bear. But it didn't sound like walking. It sounded more like dragging. Something being pulled across the dirt and leaves. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The noise stopped. I waited. Nothing. I didn't hear footsteps running away or more rustling. Just silence. I didn't have a window on the back wall where the sound had come from, so I didn't see anything. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a tree branch had fallen or shifted. I eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked around the back of the cabin. I didn't see anything unusual at first, but as I walked closer to the tree line, I noticed something in the dirt. A trail. Not a path or footsteps, but a faint line in the soil, like something had been dragged. It went from the edge of the woods toward the back of the cabin, then looped away again. I knelt down and looked closer. The trail was thin, about the width of my wrist. No footprints, no tire marks, just that line in the dirt. I felt uneasy, but I didn't panic. I told myself again it could have been anything. A fallen branch getting blown along by the wind. Maybe a raccoon dragging something. I let it go. That day, I went further up the lake trail, following the shore for about a mile. I didn't see anyone. No footprints, no campsites. It felt like I had the whole forest to myself. When I got back to the cabin, I filtered more water, had a small dinner, and read again by candlelight. But around midnight, I heard the noise again. This time it was louder. Same dragging sound. Slow, rhythmic, like something heavy moving across dry leaves and sticks. I sat up in bed and clicked on the flashlight. The sound paused, then started again. Closer. I held the light and stepped to the window on the front wall. I pointed the beam out, but the woods swallowed the light. It didn't reach far enough to see anything. I moved to the back door, opened it slightly, and shined the light out that way. Nothing, but the sound kept going. It circled the cabin. I could feel it. Like whatever it was moving around the structure, slow and steady. I stood there, waiting, listening. The dragging sound stopped suddenly. Silence again. I closed the door and locked it. I checked the windows and sat down with the flashlight in my lap. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I went outside again and found another drag mark. This time, it was closer to the cabin, maybe 10 feet from the wall, and next to it, 2 deeper impressions, like something had been pushed down into the dirt. I crouched to touch it. The ground was soft, but I couldn't tell what made it. Still, no footprints, no signs of animals, just that trail and those marks. Something didn't feel right anymore. I wasn't just unsettled. I felt watched. That day, I packed a small day bag and hiked up the hill behind the cabin to see if I could get a better view of the area. From the top, I could see the lake stretching out below, the cabin tucked near the shore like a dot among the trees. I scanned the woods for movement, but everything looked normal, still quiet. That evening, I didn't light a candle. I sat in the dark with the flashlight in my lap, listening. At some point, I must have dozed off in the chair. A loud bang woke me up. Something hit the side of the cabin, hard. I jumped up and clicked the flashlight. Another bang, this time on the back wall, then another on the side near the door. I stayed frozen, not sure what to do. I didn't want to go outside. I didn't want to open the door. I pressed my ear to the wall. Nothing. I waited until dawn, then finally opened the door. I stepped outside and walked the perimeter. That's when I saw the handprint. Not a clear one, but a long, smudged mark on the side of the cabin, just below the window. Long fingers, wide spacing. Whatever made it had dirty skin or maybe mud-covered gloves. It was human. That was enough for me. I decided I would leave. I went inside, packed everything into my backpack, and hiked straight back to the car without stopping. My heart was pounding the entire time. I didn't look back. I just wanted to get the hell out. But when I got to where I had parked the car, it wasn't there. The clearing was empty. I froze. I walked around, thinking maybe I had come out on the wrong side. But I hadn't. This was the same place. I remembered the broken stump near the edge, the rock with moss on it. This was the clearing. My car was gone. I dropped my bag and stood there in the silence. It didn't make sense. Nobody knew I was here. The keys had been with me the whole time. I never told anyone the exact location. I thought about the satellite phone in my bag. I pulled it out and turned it on. No signal. I sat on the ground and tried to stay calm. I knew I had enough food and water to last another few days. I knew how to start a fire, but none of that helped me feel better. I didn't know who was out there, or why. Eventually, I picked up my bag and walked back to the cabin. I didn't want to, but I had nowhere else to go. It was shelter. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat with my back to the wall, holding my flashlight and the knife. Around 2 a.m., I heard something again. But this time, it wasn't dragging. It was footsteps. Slow, careful steps outside the cabin. They moved to the door, then around the side, then back again. At one point, something brushed against the window, but it didn't try to get in. It just stayed out there, walking, watching. I stayed like that until the sun came up, and then I made a plan. I wasn't going to stay another night. I packed what I could carry and started walking, not on the trail,